Welcome to our 2024 gaming PC tutorial. In this video, I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know to build yourself a gaming PC. So whether this is your first build or you just want to refresh on the 2024 latest and greatest on tech, this is the video for you. So I'm going to show you how to pick your components, how to put the entire PC together, and all the other stuff you need to do to go from a pile of parts in your cart to a completed gaming PC. And of course, it is all thanks to our sponsors here at Micro Center. So let's get started. First things first, before you build a PC, you need all of the right building blocks. Now, it can be really tempting to just pick any old parts based on the budget or aesthetic, but you have to make sure that all components are compatible or they may not fit together or even turn on properly. Now, there are several online compatibility checkers, including, of course, the Micro Center PC Builder, which really are incredibly useful when finding components since they can automatically let you know if there is a compatibility issue with your hardware. The CPU, aka processor, is often referred to as the brain of the computer. Now, as far as your choices between AMD and Intel, thankfully here in 2024, there is not a bad option. And both on the Ryzen side as well as on the Intel Core side, you have a ton of selections. So specifically looking at Ryzen, on the top of the shelf here, you can see the high-end Ryzen 9 processors. You can also come down to the Ryzen 7, Ryzen 5, and sometimes even Ryzen 3. So for today, I'm going to be using the AMD Ryzen 7 7700X. This is an 8-core processor that is not only going to give us a lot of gaming performance, but importantly also productivity performance. Now, the choice between AMD and Intel and Ryzen 9 versus Ryzen 7 or whatever is largely down to price, as always. When I'm at Micro Center, I like to take advantage of their bundle deals. So this is normally a $320 processor, but when you bundle it with a motherboard and RAM, you can get the entire setup for $400, saving you a ton of money. Oftentimes, I let this dictate some of the parts that I choose because you can save an absolute fortune by getting a nice little bundle and you know that it's all going to work together. The last big thing to pay attention to is the socket and generation. This will determine what kind of motherboard you can pair the CPU with. This also determines what kind of upgrade options you have in the future. Next, we're going to choose our motherboard. So this is an important component to pair with your CPU, because while many components in a PC build are fairly universal, you could take a graphics card and install it on almost any PC, an SSD will go into almost any PC, but the CPU and motherboard need to be paired fairly close together. So if I grab this, which is a Gigabyte B650 Gaming X AX V2, you're going to see that it is an AMD Ryzen socket AM5 board. Now, remember, brand and socket are important here. You cannot take an AMD processor and put it into an Intel motherboard or vice versa. So make sure to pick out a motherboard with the socket that matches your CPU. AMD sockets right now are either the older but incredibly well supported AM4 and the newest socket being AM5. Intel, on the other hand, call their sockets LGA, numbers go here, with the latest socket being LGA 1700. Size also matters here. If you're looking to build in a small form factor case, typically you'll need a smaller motherboard that will fit. So motherboard sizes typically range from a full standard ATX going to a smaller micro ATX and an even smaller mini ATX. Generally, standard ATX motherboards will only fit in ATX size cases, but smaller motherboards can fit into larger cases. If you've got a small peg, it'll go in a big hole, but if you've got a big peg, it only fits in the big hole. That makes sense? Yeah, that's my analogy. It makes sense. Personally, I don't usually recommend making a small form factor PC as a first time build, just because it could be really difficult to maneuver in, you can get a little claustrophobic, and plus you do have to worry a lot more about airflow in a smaller chassis. And troubleshooting can be a bit of a nightmare when cables and stuff is just really, really tiny in there. But don't let me dissuade you. If you're up for the challenge, by all means go for it. I'll just say a lot of first time builders have a much easier time building in a larger chassis. For a first-time build, you probably want to opt for a standard ATX or a micro ATX for the most amount of options possible. Next up, we're choosing our memory or RAM. Now, this is a very important component in your system. So for this video, I'm going to be going with the G.Skill Flare X5. So this is specifically 32 gigabytes running at 6,000 megatransfers per second. Memory, commonly known as RAM, is kind of what it sounds like. It determines how much data your PC can hold in short-term memory. This is very important for multitasking and active programs such as web browsers, video editing, graphic design, and even gaming. One thing to keep in mind is that DDR5 is the latest generation of RAM, but DDR4 is still widely available. DDR5 is faster, but currently more expensive than the older DDR4 generation. So the decision here is always going to be what kind of memory does your motherboard support. So if you're using an Intel processor, you could actually have either a DDR4 or a DDR5 motherboard. Really kind of depends. Typically, the cheaper motherboards use DDR4, the higher-end motherboards use DDR5. There's not a massive difference in performance between the two, but you'll definitely want to make sure that you pick the correct RAM for your board. Now, because we're going with AMD Ryzen 7000, our decision's already been made for us. We have to use DDR5. And the good thing is, this is actually part of the bundle that I'm picking up here at Micro Center. So I'm getting this, the motherboard and the CPU all together, which means that not only am I saving money, but importantly, I also know they are fully compatible. When it comes to choosing the specific kit of RAM you want to look for, there's two things that I would say. First and foremost, get enough capacity. So you could technically get away with 8 gigabytes of RAM if you're doing a super budget PC, but really get at least 16 gigabytes and ideally 32. It is going to give you a lot of flexibility in the future for multitasking, gaming, all that kind of stuff. And it's not that much more expensive. On top of that, make sure to get a dual channel kit. So sometimes if you wanted to, you could get a single stick of memory that will fully function. You're not gonna break anything, but you're going to be leaving significant performance on the table. Your CPU and your motherboard are both designed with dual channel memory in mind. And honestly, the vast majority of the kits here at Micro Center are going to be in dual channel configuration. So just keep that in mind. Get at least 2 sticks of RAM at a minimum of 16 gigabytes for a gaming PC in 2024. I think that's a very safe thing. 32 gigs if you can swing it. February is Build Your Own Month at Micro Center, which is the perfect opportunity to build, upgrade, and importantly save with a bunch of great deals that Micro Center have. Now, of course, they have great deals year-round, but this is the perfect time to upgrade your existing system or use this tutorial and build an all-new one. On top of that, there is a brand new Micro Center opening in Charlotte in early 2024. Not only will they have a huge selection of PC components, but once the store opens, you can receive a free 128 gig flash drive by signing up at the link in the description. Now it's time to get to the good part. The GPU is probably the single most important component for a PC when it comes to gaming. Like how a CPU processes data, the GPU processes data, but more specifically graphics data. You can think of the CPU as your sort of jack of all trades, but a GPU is highly specialized in processing tasks such as AI-related work, game, or video data. Usually, everything else being equal, the more powerful a GPU is, the more FPS and resolution you can push in games. So there are 3 options, which is going to be AMD, Intel, and NVIDIA. Now, much like with CPUs, you can't really go too wrong. All of these items are very heavily priced according to their performance level, which really makes your decision a little bit easier. The more of your budget that you can put into the graphics card will directly correlate to additional gaming performance. Now, you want to be a little bit reasonable. You don't want to be like SpongeBob with one huge beefy arm or one little noodle arm. You want to make sure that you're getting a decent power supply and CPU motherboard and all the stuff to support it. But really, when it comes to gaming performance, the graphics card is what is going to dictate your resolution, your frame rate, all of that kind of stuff. So for this video, I am going to be taking advantage of the fairly new RTX 4070 Super. Now this currently is running about $600. Obviously prices will vary by the time you watch this video, but it's a pretty high-end card, okay? So this is going to deliver plenty of performance for some 4K gaming, some higher frame rate like 1440p gaming and whatnot, 12 gigs of RAM. It is a good card, generally speaking. You can go really in-depth with graphics cards, but the 2 most important specs to look for are processing power and memory. Now, there's no general recommendation for processing power of a GPU. I mean, that's gonna come down to the games you wanna play, what resolution and refresh rate your monitor can handle, and of course, the big elephant in the room, what kind of budget you have to work with. GPU memory is a little different from RAM, so it's called VRAM here, and that too is a very specialized thing for graphics. Another oversimplification, but generally speaking, more VRAM and more bandwidth is better. It's a little easier to make a recommendation here when it comes to actual how much RAM you need for your card. So I would say you want at least 8 gigabytes of VRAM to play today's demanding games. But honestly, if you've got the budget for it, 10 or 12 gigabytes of VRAM can definitely make a difference and give you a little bit more comfort level in the future. Next up, we're going to be choosing the case. Now the case is definitely the most personal aspect of your PC build. This is where the aesthetics come in, but also there's a lot of functionality. So I'm going to be going with this Lian Li LandCool 216. This is an incredibly popular case. It's a very safe bet. It's very representative of the sort of average PC build because you've got a lot of flexibility on the inside. It's very easy to work in. You've got yourself 3 fans, including 2 RGB fans in the front, so you don't have to do a lot of extra work to actually make this thing look cool. It comes in different colors. I'm gonna go with the white one because I personally think it pops. We also have plenty of space for our ATX motherboard and our graphics card. Some things to consider when you're choosing your case outside of the aesthetics is that you do want to make sure you have a reasonable amount of space, especially if you want to go for a little bit more of a higher end system. So take, for example, your graphics card support. So your graphics card is going to live right in here, but you can see that there's all this extra space on the side. That's because, especially these days, higher end graphics cards can actually be quite tall, so you actually need a little bit of this extra space to make sure that they will clear and you have room to plug in like your power cables and stuff. So going with something like this 216 is going to be a nice safe bet that should last for years and years in the future. Plenty of space to install like radiators on top. Again, you've got the fans, you've got the basement where you can hide your power supply and some cables and stuff. Like I mentioned with motherboards, there are different sizes of cases. The standard size ATX cases are the traditional PC tower size, but there are smaller micro ATX and mini ATX cases if you do want to go for a smaller footprint. Just remember, it may make building in them a little bit tricky, and you do need to be mindful of airflow. On the other end of the extreme, you have eATX size cases, which are massive Chungalinos that are specifically designed to house and show off your big bulky components, like graphics cards that are bigger than my head, or intricate hardline water cooling. For first-time builders, I recommend just a standard ATX case, as it will probably provide enough airflow and enough space to comfortably build in, and it's a little bit of an easier process. But again, choose the case that you want best. It's gonna not only set up the aesthetic, it's gonna decide if it goes on your desk, below your desk, and it's the part that looks cool. When it comes to cooling your CPU, there are tons of options. So on the high end, you can do something like this, which is a hardline loop. Now this, as cool as it is way outside the scope of a PC tutorial. So traditionally, you're gonna choose one of two options, air or liquid cooling. So if you wanna do air cooling, there are options such as this, which is an AK400. It's a fairly straightforward air cooler. Honestly, if this is your first time building a PC, this is usually the right move unless you have a very, very high-end CPU. We'll talk a little bit about this later, but the main thing I'm going to show you is how to install an all-in-one liquid cooler. As you can see, there are tons and tons of options. So the main things to consider would be the size and what kind of CPU you're cooling. So for us with our Ryzen 7 7700X, it's actually a fairly efficient chip. We do not need a crazy cooler, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to go with a very high-end Lee, specifically 360mm radiator. So the way the sizes work is that this is a 360mm radiator, which is essentially three 120mm fans. So if I find a 240, for example, this is two 120mm fans, or by the same token, I could do two 140mm fans, which would equal 280. The way you choose this is very much down to your case. So all cases will list what kind of radiator and fan support that they have. So for our case, we have up to a 360mm radiator on the top, but some cases you could also mount it on the front or even sometimes on the bottom. But traditionally, your radiator, your AIO will be installed either in the front or on the top. So we're gonna be using this one. This is a very high-end AIO. It's more than we need, but I'm gonna show you for the purposes of this tutorial. It also has a neat little screen on it too. So I'll show you how to install this. And while air cooling is the safer bet for most first-time builders, if you want that sort of flashy RGB fans, the liquid cooler, the whole thing, and you want to get the maximum performance, this is a great move. Luckily, a lot of low and mid-range CPUs you buy will come with a stock cooler in the box. For most people, this is completely fine. It's not flashy and you won't want to push limits with overclocking, but it is a perfectly reasonable option that you can always upgrade down the line. Now when it comes to high-end processors, they typically don't ship with stock coolers at all, as manufacturers expect you to get a better cooler anyway, and the demands of those chips are a lot more than a little stock cooler can handle. A high-performance air cooler will do just as good of a job, if not better, than all but the beefiest AIO liquid cooling solutions. But there are other pros and cons to each. Liquid cooling draws the heat away from the CPU via a heatsink, and then the liquid carries that heat all the way through a radiator to be dissipated. Now this method is typically quieter than air cooling, and the higher end coolers have neat little screens that could show you like some specs or a GIF loop, like they're very flashy, but they typically require multiple fan slots in your case, which can be difficult to install based on the configuration. It's a lot more work to install to begin with. Not to mention there's a small, but still there's a risk of liquid leaking from that cooler and damaging other components. Air cooling is the tried and true cooling method. It's just a fan blowing air through a heatsink that is drawing that heat away from the CPU. It's simple, which means it's less likely to break, but high performance air coolers do have some cons, such as they typically take up a lot of space. If your PC case doesn't have a lot of clearance, or if you have a smaller motherboard, sometimes that can actually be very restrictive as far as how easily you can access the PC. And on top of that, if you're going to be moving your PC around a lot, it's not necessarily a great idea to have a heavy air cooler, just because the good ones, while they're very good at cooling, are very heavy. They can put a lot of strain on the board and the mounting points. While it definitely depends on the cooler that you choose, air coolers can get a little bit on the loud side, especially when the PC is working on a heavy load like gaming. But look, ultimately the choice is up to you. I personally tend to lean more towards solid air coolers, such as Noctua options, but I'd say most gamers, especially on the high end, tend to take advantage of liquid cooling. Next up, we're choosing our power supply. This is a critical component of every PC build. It is quite literally the beating heart supplying power to every component in the system. You want something high quality, and you want to make sure that you have plenty of capacity. It is a component that takes AC power from the wall and converts it into stable DC power that the PC can actually use. It then distributes power through cables, all like veins throughout the PC. Now, power supplies measure output via watts. It's fairly straightforward. I mean, you just need to add up the power requirements of your PC components and then choose a power supply that exceeds that number. Usually your CPU and especially your GPU will have minimum recommended wattages, which is a great place to start. Again, Micro Center has an online PC builder that will help you calculate how much power your power supply needs, but just as a baseline, a lower to mid-tier PC may need something like 500 or 600 watts, an upper tier system may need something closer to 750 watts, and a high-end system will likely need 850 watts plus. Definitely do the math on your own system. You don't want your computer to draw more power than the power supply can provide, or else it will just crash or shut down immediately, or you could even do long-term damage to your system. For this build, I'm going to go with this, the MSI Mag AA50G PCI 5. There's a few reasons why I like this power supply. First of all, 850 watts is going to be plenty for this system, but I don't mind that typically for a system because power supplies usually have quite long warranties and can last for several iterations of your system, so having a little bit of that extra margin is nice to have. Something else to consider is some of the specs on this. So because we are using an RTX 4070 Super, a 40 series GPU, we're actually gonna want to take advantage of the PCI 5 specs. You'll see here it says ATX 3.0 compatible, PCI 5.0 ready. And what that means is that it has, with the actual cables in the box, a specific cable which is designed to be used for RTX 40 series cards. This is nice because for our GPU, if we don't have this built into the power supply, we actually have to use an adapter, which technically will work, but I don't really recommend it. So if you have the luxury of buying a brand new power supply for your system, getting something with ATX 3.0 is very nice to have that future-proofing built in. Other things to consider here is that this is a fully modular power supply, which means that we can easily plug in only the actual cables we need so that our cable runs can be a little bit cleaner. And this is also an 80+ gold rated power supply. 80+ ratings, while sometimes you can kind of use them as a little bit of a bar for quality, typically they're much more meant for the actual efficiency of your power supply. So you can do 80+ white, silver, gold, platinum, they go up quite a bit. For me, gold is usually the right sweet spot between price, efficiency, and typically quality. So this will be what will power our gaming PC. Now, when it comes to storage for your system, you have a couple of options. So old school PCs traditionally use hard drives. We are going to use a hard drive for the system, but for Windows, for gaming, for all of your normal use, I would highly recommend an SSD. If RAM is short-term memory, storage like SSDs and hard drives are more like long-term memory. They hold all of your data like your computer programs, photos, videos, games, etc., ready to be accessed whenever you need them. There are two main types of SSDs to choose from. SATA, which are older school and use these same connectors as a hard drive and can easily be swapped into, like, say, an older system, for example. But if you're building a modern system, I recommend an M2 NVMe SSD. They use the same type of flash memory as regular SSDs do, but they get rid of that old SATA connection that limited their speeds. Top-of-the-line NVMe SSDs are about 60 times faster than hard drives. That's right, 60 times faster. Like RAM, you want to pay attention to speed and capacity here. One reason to go with an NVMe SSD is that they are pretty much universally fast enough for basically any task you could throw at them. I mean, even a slow NVMe drive will be faster than any other hard drive or regular SSD out there. As for capacity, I recommend at least 500 gigabytes if you pair it with something like a hard drive, but honestly, 1 or even 2 terabyte NVMe drives are relatively cheap these days and will give you plenty of headroom to store all of your games. So for this system, we're gonna go high-end with this Samsung 990 Pro. You can also install a hard drive. Now, technically you could use a hard drive instead of an SSD, but I would highly recommend against it. But what a hard drive does have over an SSD is a lot of capacity for not a lot of money. So take, for example, this, which is a WD Blue 4TB drive for only 50 bucks. You're also going to almost certainly want a copy of Windows 11 for your gaming PC. Now, technically you could do Windows 10, although at this point Windows 11 is pretty much the no-brainer. There's Windows 11 Home as well as Pro. Honestly, you can just get Windows 11 Home, but this, I'll show you how to install it later, but it is very important to have a copy of Windows. Otherwise, your PC will have a great view of the BIOS screen. Or you can install Linux, but that's a little bit outside the scope for a PC tutorial. All right, my friends, it is time to build ourselves a gaming computer. So if this is your first time building, I'm gonna walk you through step by step all of the components, how we put them together, some common issues, the whole thing. But sit back, relax, this is gonna be easy and fun, and we're not gonna have any problems at all. Positivity, it's an important element of PC building. So, right here, I've got all of the components that we need for the build laid out here. So, what you'll actually need to build your computer, outside of the parts to do it with, is going to be a decent sized workspace. So a desk, a table, make sure you have at least a little bit of space, because trust me, once you start opening all these boxes, it gets cluttered very quickly. And you need a couple of tools. And by couple, I mean a knife to open boxes and a Phillips screwdriver. That's literally it. It is very simple. All the other bits and bobs, cables, screws, all that kind of stuff should be included in the various component boxes that we're going to be using. Now, beyond that, it's really pretty straightforward. Let's clear up some space, grab our case box, and we will begin unboxing and building our gaming computer. I always like to start with the case for a PC build, not only so that you can sort of wrap your head around the physical dimensions, maybe take a look and kind of get a sense for how you're actually going to build it, but also I like to install the power supply too to get a couple of the components out of the way before we move on to some of the more complicated bits. So with this particular case, we actually have a box of accessories, which you will want to hold on to. But other than that, I'm actually going to flip this upside down and pull the box over the actual case. Kind of like how if you're unboxing like a TV or something, you want to sort of pull the box up and over, otherwise it's a pain. There we go. So I actually typically like to keep the case box handy. This is a great spot to put all of your random trash from the actual build. So packaging materials and that kind of stuff. And sometimes you need to go back through there and realize you forgot a screw or something. So I just like to use that as like sort of my temporary storage. All right, with our plastic removed, we got our first good look at the case that we will be spending the next several hours building in. So before we do anything, let's go ahead and take off the side panels and wrap our heads around what the actual physical case looks like. So with this one particularly, it's actually really nice. We have some thumb screws on the back, so it's very easy to access. Sometimes, like actually right now, you will need to use a screwdriver to get these screws started, mostly because they tend to come a little like over tightened from the factory. So if any of these screws are annoying, just give them a little loosen with your screwdriver. So every case is going to be a little different, and honestly, every PC build is going to be a little different. So I'm going to speak sort of generally, but I will kind of give you the top line stuff to pay attention to as you build something. So for this case, I'm going to remove all of the core panels. So this is the top panel. We will have to remove this later to install the AIO anyway. So I'm gonna just put this off to the side. When it comes to taking the back panel off, this actually has no screws. So you just pop it right off, toss it off to the side here. And then we've got our glass side panel. So I believe they just need that one screw, right? And there we go, we can take off our glass side panel. And then because this case has a basement, we also have one additional screw on the bottom. And we're gonna wanna remove that. So again, all cases are gonna be a little different. This, because it has the mesh bottom, makes it a little bit easier for us to run some cabling, install a power supply, that kind of thing. I'm gonna put my screw off to the side. Just a little note, you're gonna have a lot of screws through this process. Make sure to have a little handy spot. I usually just dedicate a small corner for it, but you can use like a little magnetic mount or a little bowl or whatever. Just don't lose them. There's only actually like a handful of types of screws, so some of them are a little interchangeable, but just try to keep them organized so that when you're looking to put something back together, you won't be like, uh-oh, it got put in the trash, because I've never done that before. Behold, a magnetic mat, so I can put my screw right there and I don't lose it. With the basement cover taken off, we now have pretty much full access to the case. So before we actually start building anything, let me just give you a quick little run through about what we're looking at. So this part right here in the middle is where our motherboard will mount. So we'll explain that in a little bit, but generally speaking, just so you have the lay of the land, the motherboard goes here. Our graphics card is gonna go roughly right here. We're gonna have our all-in-one liquid cooler mounted on the top of the chassis. Now this actually, technically we could mount it up front too, but because it already has a couple of fans pre-installed, it'll be a pretty easy bet just to put it on the top. The power supply is going to go down here, our hard drive is going to go right here, and that's largely it. So some things to consider. We've got ourselves some little grommets so we can run cables through here, so it'll help to kind of do a little bit of management. We also do have, if I flip it over this side, a lot more cable management that is already built into the back. Now, you're gonna hear the words cable management a lot throughout this video. All that means is there's two ways of building a PC. You could throw the components in there, turn it on, it works, and then smash the side panels on and hope for the best. You should take a little time, especially when we're done with the system, but even while we're actually building, to try to run cables neatly. Not only is it going to make your life a lot easier when you try to put the side panel on and you have a pile of cables that thick, but also, as you can see with a case like this, there's a nice little bit of space back here, so there's plenty of room, and there's actually sort of not only guides, but these sort of like Velcro sort of cable runs that are already built in. So as we install components, I'm going to try my best to run cables in a clean, natural way. Don't worry about getting it perfect. Once we've actually made sure the system is fully functional, we will go back through there and double check things. But as you run stuff, take 30 extra seconds and run it through a cable panel or a cable sleeve or a cable guide versus just letting it dangle everywhere. It will definitely make your life a lot easier when it comes time to clean it up. That's largely it. The only other thing I'll show you, and we'll deal with this in a minute, we have our hard drive sort of trays down here, but we do not need to use these just yet, so you can just leave those in place. So let us begin by installing our first component into our stripped down case, which is going to be the power supply. Now, I like to start with the power supply. There's a few ways that you could approach this, but I like to install the power supply first to make sure that I can start running some cables and getting them out of the way. Now, I will say there's one thing you could do, which would be a different order of operation for this tutorial. I would generally recommend for you to open up all of your components and do a test before you put everything in your actual case. You do not have to do that. I'm not going to do that today. But even though it's rare, it does happen that maybe there's some incompatibility issue with your parts. Maybe a part just came damaged or broken out of the box, and it's not fun when you spend several hours building the PC, hit that big power button and nothing happens and you have to tear it all apart to troubleshoot, right? That is a thing you may have to deal with. So it is usually a good idea to actually take all of your components, set them out on like a basic table like this, so motherboard, graphics card, yada, 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 plug it all into a power supply out of the case, and ensure that it actually fires up and it works, right? All you do is just make sure that everything functions, and then you can tear it all apart and put it in the case. But for now, I'm going to be building everything inside the case and assuming that all of our components are fully functional and fully compatible. What could go wrong? Okay, so inside our power supply box, there's gonna be a few things. It's fairly straightforward. So there's a little thing saying, hey, plug your cable all the way in. We'll go over this in a little bit. Then we have the power supply itself. Now, there are, like I was saying earlier, Micro Center, a couple of different sizes of power supply. This is a normal HX supply, so it's a very standard square little box. And this one, as you can see, is fully modular. So none of the actual connectors that go to our motherboard and our system are installed right now because they're all in this little pouch. Now, these pouches are meant to be kept. So a lot of the stuff that we're working through here, these boxes, you can just chuck it, right? Like you don't really need them. But this pouch full of power supply cables is very helpful because we're only going to plug in the things that we need for this system. But say in the future we wanted to add more hard drives or a beefier graphics card or whatever the case is, these cables are what you will need to expand the power supply. And keep in mind that power supply cables are not universal. You want to use cables that are designed for your power supply. They may look very similar, but oftentimes they are not compatible and you may cause damage. So keep this little bag full of cables handy. If you're using a lower end power supply that's not modular, well, these will all just be dangling off the power supply and you just pluck them out of the way. But if you've got a modular or semi-modular supply, it makes it a lot easier to sort of clean up the aesthetics so you don't have a mess of cables all hanging around in the middle. So we can check this box. I will say the only thing we want to make sure we find, in addition to our cables, are some screws. So there should be 4 little screws in a bag. So in this one, it is going to be, I think, in here. But if you unbox your power supply and don't find 4 little screws, stop and look closer because we're going to need those screws in about 47 seconds. So I have my standard IEC power cable. So this just goes from the back of the power supply into your outlet. So make sure to hold on to this. And in this bag, we have all of the other cables that we will need. So I will go ahead and walk you through them right now. Like I said earlier, We're actually not going to use all of these for this build. And I'll be honest, almost no one needs all of these connected at the same time. But they give you extras so that just in case you're building a system with 10 hard drives or some crazy stuff or whatever, you should have all the cables you need. But let me actually walk you through what is what here, because there's a lot. And I'll admit, this is a little intimidating. I think when it's a first-time builder especially, you look at all these cables and you're like, yikes, but it's totally fine. You're like, the good thing about literally all of these power cables is that you really can't do it wrong. As long as you fully seat it, it will be fine. You're not gonna be able to accidentally like put it upside down without using an insane amount of force. You're not gonna be able to plug it into the wrong thing. Like, everything is keyed, everything is going to be unique, so it's not anywhere near as scary as it seems. So let me walk you through it really quick. The first cable we're gonna start out with is our 20+4 pin. So this is the main power to the motherboard. So you can see it's gonna be 20+4. The 4 is always attached, so it's really like a 24 pin. And then on the other side, this is the end that we're going to plug into the power supply. So I'm gonna actually do that right now. This is a cable that you will need 100% of the time. So it's modular just because reasons, but yeah, you're always going to need this cable. So for this, it's very straightforward. We're gonna plug in the left and the right side of our cables and make sure that we get the little click. It's 1, 2, perfect. So again, 100% of gaming PCs are going to need this cable, so we always are going to plug that in. Next up, we're going to grab one that's a little bit more unusual, especially if you've not built a PC in the last couple of years. So this is known as the 12 volt, 600 watts, PCI 5.0, ATX 3.0. There's a lot of names for this cable. But essentially what this is a new high power cable specifically for graphics cards. As I'm recording this video, it is almost exclusively used on NVIDIA graphics cards. Now, you may have heard of this cable because it has a little bit of a problematic start to life. Some people have had issues with these things melting or not working well because it's a 600 watt cable that is very thin. Now, because we have a power supply that is designed to be used with this, because you can use like an adapter to get this out of a couple of these guys. The main thing is, and it's really straightforward, make sure you are fully seating this cable not only into your power supply, but also into your graphics card. Part of the reason I put this little pamphlet in here saying, hey, plug it all the way in so it don't melt. Which sounds scarier than it is, should be totally fine. So this cable, like almost everything we're doing here, is only going to go in one way. So you see this little clip is gonna go into this hole, and you've got these little pins that go onto the bottom. So we're just gonna line it up, make sure it's seated, give it a nice little bit of force. You get a weak little click, but it is in there. We'll give it a little tug just to make sure. And there you go. You've got yourself the power supply to graphics card connector. Now, I am using this and only this for our graphics card because I am using an RTX 40 series card. Now, if I was using an Intel GPU, an AMD GPU, an older NVIDIA GPU, I would not be using this cable. Instead, I would be using this PCI power. So this is known as a 6+2 connector. And this is a tried and true method that graphics cards have used for many years. It's not quite as clean because, so what this single cable will do is like 600 watts. To do this with PCI cables, you need to use several of these. And as you can see, they have these little like pigtail things because graphics cards have different levels of power needed. So some graphics cards may only need a single 6-pin, or you may need to connect the 6+2, making it an 8-pin, or you may need 2 of these, or sometimes 3. It depends on the card, it's gonna completely vary, but it will tell you what kind of actual power you need on your graphics card box. If your graphics card needs these, it's super simple. So just the same way we did it before, this is the end that would go into your power supply. So again, it's the 6+2, but the other end is going to be specific. So you can see right here, it says CPU and PCIe. So these 2 and these 2 are all the same. Just like all of the rest of the connectors, as far as installing this, the power supply, it is dead simple. So we're gonna install one of these just to show you what it would be like. So we're gonna click it in place. And if we were not using this NVIDIA 40 series GPU, I would be using these 8-pin connectors as opposed to the fancy new one. But because we are using a RTX 4070 Super, I'm actually gonna unplug that and put this off to the side, specifically in our pouch for future use. Oh, found the screws. They're hiding in the bag with the pouch. Remember those screws I told you to look for? Found them. Next up is our CPU power cable. So while that big 20+4 pin connector is what supplies power to the motherboard, this connector is specifically for your CPU. This is an 8-pin CPU power connector. So depending on your motherboard, you may need any number of these. So for a lower-end system, sometimes you actually only need the 4 pins. You actually would split this connector into half. You can also click it together, and it is an 8-pin, which is the most standard. Some higher-end motherboards actually have support for 2 of these. You actually don't typically need to install 2 of them. They're more so for like extreme overclocking. But general rule of thumb, if you have the power from your power supply, so if you have 2 of these in the box and your motherboard wants 2 of them, plug them in. But typically, an 8-pin is all you need to power everything but the most power-hungry CPUs on the planet. And this is going to install the exact same way as the PCI. So you'll see that the other end that goes in the power supply is the same, so it's the 8-pin. So you line it up with the CPU and PCIe. These are all the same, so it doesn't matter. So we line it up, click it, and this is ready to go into our motherboard connector, specifically the CPU slot. So for our build, that's actually almost everything we need as far as power goes. So there are a couple of other connectors that I will show you really quick here. So if I grab this one right here, this is known as SATA. So SATA is a little bit of an older school standard. It's meant more so for like lower powered accessories. So originally it was meant for hard drives, optical drives, older school SSDs. Oftentimes these days, you're actually gonna use this more so for auxiliary things. So for example, you may need it for your fans, you may need it for the pump, you may need it for your all-in-one liquid cooler. Like there's a bunch of different things that you could use this for. So traditionally, you're gonna need to at least install 1 of these. And I think for this system, this has what, 1, 2, 3, it has 3 individual leads on it. That should be plenty for the system. So this is probably the most unique looking actual connector. So you'll see it's very long and skinny and it has a little notch. That notch is very helpful because it means that you're only going to install this one way. So I'm gonna just put 1 of these into our power supply for now. I'll explain how to connect it once we actually need it. But almost every build is gonna want at least 1 of these SATA connectors installed on our power supply. Another cable that you may see, although is thankfully becoming a little bit less common, is Molex. So you'll see this janky looking connector is old school. Like this is probably the oldest school power standard that's still around. I mean, this has been around since freaking forever. This is similar to SATA in that it is meant for lower power accessories. So this used to be used for like floppy disk drives. Thankfully, most systems, you actually won't need this. Usually it's like fan headers and stuff will still use Molex. It's kind of annoying because it's got this like sort of like, I don't know how you would call it, like a little like clippy, like clampy guy. So you can see you kind of like sort of pinch it to install it. Look, I don't like these things. They're really fiddly because sometimes you think you've got it all the way installed, it's not. You have to really kind of tug it out. If your system doesn't need one of these, feel free to not plug this cable in at all. But if you think you may want to do it, you don't want to double check all your components, it's not a terrible idea to plug this in. As you can see right here on the actual power supply, these are all for SATA or Molex, so it doesn't matter. So we could install this, plug it in, and just sort of tuck this cable off to the side if we want to use it later. But for these purposes, and because I don't think I need Molex for anything in this system, I'm going to disconnect this and put it in a little cable pouch. And if we find that we need it later, all we gotta do is pop open this little basement and plug one of these into the power supply and we'll be good to go. But I think we can safely not use this today. Other than that, that's pretty much it. So we have a few extra versions of the cables. So again, I've got more PCI leads here. I was about to put up this second CPU power connector, but I just checked my motherboard. It actually does support 8 plus 4 pins. You don't have to do this. I've run plenty of systems that have that auxiliary port and I don't pull anywhere near enough power for it, so it's like not necessary. But we have the cable, it's just a little extra run. And technically, if we ever lose our mind and overclock this thing to a gajillion gigahertz, it may need this cable. So it's on the board, I'm gonna go ahead and install it. Now it's time to install the power supply in our case. So power supplies are very straightforward. Now, sometimes they have like interesting designs. You can see this one has the MSI logo and the MAG logo on this side. So it's meant so that it will look good on either way. But the important thing to keep in mind is that while all of your internal connectors are on one side, this is obviously the back of the power supply where you have your on-off switch, your IEC, and your little fan button. But you will also find a fan. It is important to give access to fresh air for this fan. So when it comes to installing it in the case, the vast majority of cases these days will install the power supply on the bottom. Whether you have a basement or not, it almost always goes on the bottom. If I was installing this on the top of the case, then typically you would want to have the fan up so the fan can pull in air from the top. But because I'm installing it on the bottom of the case, I'm going to go fan down. So you can see here that I actually have a little fan filter specifically for the power supply. So this actually pops out from the bottom. This is fairly standard on most cases. It's just a little dust filter, but it gives you a very good sense for where the airflow is going to be coming from your power supply. So what we're gonna do is we're going to take our power supply. Actually, I think with this system, it doesn't matter. We can go left or right. We're gonna line it up with that fan facing down, so it's gonna be able to pull in air from here. So we're gonna slide this into place. Now it actually has these nice little rubber feet, which help us to sort of center things up. And don't worry about your cables right now. They're all kind of dangling out the back. It's totally fine. This part is very simple. We just need to install the 4 screws to hold our power supply into place. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab a screw. So the only thing you may have to do is power supplies, they always sit roughly right, but oftentimes they're like slightly off, so maybe be leaning one way or another. So just visually make sure that you can see all of the screw holes. So with this, I'm actually a little bit low, so I make sure that it's seated completely flat, which it looks like it is. So you may just need to do a little bit of wiggling to make sure. So just pick any of the sides, doesn't matter where you start. So we're just gonna do it right here. And then we're gonna get this installed. So when it comes to installing, actually really all components, there's a couple things to keep in mind. First and foremost, don't tighten it down until you've got it into place. You know, it's just like almost anything in life. You wanna make sure that you got all your screws into place before you do the final tighten. On top of that, you should do it in a cross pattern. So I started with this bottom left screw. To make sure that I'm applying even pressure, I'm now going to go to the top right screw to install that. Now it's not super important when it comes to a power supply because there's not like any crazy tension or anything you have to worry about. But some other components, specifically when it comes to something like a CPU cooler, this is actually very important. But honestly, again, this is just good general life advice. Cross patterns, whether it's your wheel, whether it's your power supply, whether it's your CPU, whether it's your door handle that has 4 screws for some reason, whatever the case is, it's always good to go on opposite corners so you're evenly applying pressure to whatever it is that you're installing. Once you got the first 2 screws in, you can kind of let go of the power supply, and then these should go in a little bit easier. Again, we're just gonna do it kind of light to make sure that we've got everything lined up correctly. And for this final screw, we actually can, assuming that everything looks fine, which it is, we've got access to everything, we actually can now start tightening things now that we know that it is all lined up. Once you've got these screws tightened up, you have successfully installed yourself a power supply in your gaming PC. That's step 1 of just a couple more. There's a few. We'll be here for a couple more hours. All right, so for now we're clear to take our case and just set it off to the side because we are going to begin building up our motherboard. So we're gonna be looking for a few components here. So we're going to have not only, of course, the motherboard, which is important, but we're also going to grab our CPU, we're going to grab our memory, and assuming you're using an M.2 SSD, we're also going to be grabbing this. If you're using a hard drive, which hopefully you're not, or a SATA SSD, we'll do that later. But for this, we need all 4 of these things because they're all going to be installed onto our motherboard. So before we open all these up, let me give you a quick little tour around the board itself. So motherboards, there's a few things to know about this. Again, a motherboard is where all of your components are going to connect. So this is an important component. There's a few things to keep in mind as we're actually doing this. So again, I'm gonna flip it over to the back. There is some information here. There's also should be a manual on the inside, but it'll give you a little bit of basic stuff. It'll tell you about the compatibility, yada, yada, yada. None of this is important, but I will tell you what, while you build this up, keep the box handy. I actually like building my motherboard up on the box because it is fairly safe against stuff like static electricity. Now, okay, so Ken is gonna now demonstrate what you're not supposed to do, which is to rub your socks on carpet and try to zap things. But I'll be honest, most of these things are relatively durable to the point where you would have to try real hard to cause it, yeah, there you go. Thank you for the illustration. Yeah, so there you go, didn't kill it. You see what happened? But what I do like to do is pull the motherboard out, and once I get my accessories out, I'm gonna put this on the box and use that as my little build area. So, motherboard, we'll take a look at in a second. Below that, we have a few things that we will want to pull out. So because this motherboard has Wi-Fi, it's gonna have our Wi-Fi antennas. We're gonna toss that off to the side. We have a slightly smaller instruction manual compared to what you used to get back in the day. So it's gonna give me a little bit of info here. You may wanna pull up the PDF online. If you don't have the full manual, this is gonna give us some very basic stuff, but there are a few things in this manual which are nice to have, such as your pinouts for your front panel connectors, and a little bit more of a thorough overview of all of the components on the board. So, like a lot of components when it comes to building a PC, every motherboard is gonna be a little different. So I'm gonna walk you through this specific Gigabyte B650 board. There's some similarities between all boards, there's some similarities between AMD boards, but always safe bet is to actually find that manual that comes with your motherboard and take a look through, and it'll just kind of explain to you where each item is. Now, beyond the Wi-Fi module on the board, there are a few accessories here. So we have a couple of screws. Actually, I have a bunch of screws. So these will be to install SSDs. So we're just gonna put these off to the side. We also have a couple, and by couple I mean 2 SATA cables. Now, we're going to be using this for our hard drive, but again, we would use these SATA cables for a traditional hard drive, a SATA SSD, an optical drive if you're using one of those. SATA cables are nice, and they typically, not always, but typically come with your motherboard. The board itself, this is an ATX motherboard, so the most standard size for, I would say, the majority of first-time builders especially. So what you'll see is a whole lot of stuff inside this plastic bag. So I'm gonna set this down here. Now, I'm not gonna try to scare you like, oh, it's super dangerous, because it's not, right? Like, try not to get your greasy hands all over it. Maybe wash your hands before you do the build, but like, components are pretty durable these days. Not saying you couldn't break something if you try, or if you drop it or whatever, but again, if you've never built a PC before, this is gonna probably look a little intimidating, but it's really not that bad. So, a few ground rules. First and foremost, before you do anything with this PC, take a look around. When this goes into the case, it's a lot harder to find some of these little connectors. It'll really pay off if you take this opportunity to learn where all of the different bits and bobs are on the system. So when this is in your case and you're trying to run a cable and it's dark and you can't see and blah, 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 it is so much better when you know, oh, I know, that's on the bottom right and you can find it. So let me walk you through it really quick here. First of all, we're going to see our CPU socket. So regardless of whether this is AMD or Intel, it's pretty much always in the top middle. So this is where, surprise, surprise, your CPU goes. We'll explain that in just a second. So right here we have our RAM slots. So you'll see that this board has 4. Sometimes you'll only have 2 slots if it's a smaller or cheaper motherboard, but 4 is pretty standard for this kind of thing. Below our CPU, we're going to see our first of several M.2 SSD slots. So what I'll do is actually I'll go ahead and open this up. Usually you're gonna have like a little heatsink, so it's gonna look different on every board. So if we remove the heatsink, what you'll see is a little slot to install our M.2 SSD. We'll get to that in a minute, but just keep in mind that oftentimes it's a little hidden. So this one actually says M.2 SSD on it, but you might not know, unless you're looking closely, we can also install SSDs down here. So if I take this cover off, I can show you. So underneath this cover, you'll see that this board has 2 more M.2 slots for a total of 3. This is a point where it might be helpful to consult your manual because sometimes these are actually kind of hidden. So I've seen these that go on the back of a motherboard, especially for like smaller ITX boards. And again, you wouldn't necessarily think that this is even something you could remove, much less that you have hidden slots underneath. So again, for this board, we have a total of 3 slots. Again, you could check your manual. General rule of thumb is that top slot is gonna be the one you want to populate first. It's typically the fastest, it's the one that's closest, it's the one that's gonna have the best traces, but theoretically, any of these are going to function. So right below our top M.2 slot, we have this, which is our PCI Express slot. This is where you will install your graphics card. Now you can see we actually have a total of 3. So we have 1 on top and then 2 more a little bit lower down. Again, every motherboard is going to be a little different. Smaller motherboards just have fewer slots because they're typically about this size on top, but they just sort of lose some of that sort of height. So if you only have 1 slot, that's actually kind of fine because the vast majority of systems are only going to install a single graphics card. You can use these for graphics cards as well, but you shouldn't because this is a full speed 16x slot. These are typically 8x or 4x or an older generation. Usually what you'll use for these additional slots are things like video capture cards or RAID controllers or things that are possible to do on your system, but a little less common. So for our system, we're not going to be using these at all. But like I said, with the SSD, which should go on the top slot, your graphics card definitely should go in the top one. You can also see that this one is a little bit more robust. So unlike these that are plastic, this is made of metal. So it's going to be a little bit more durable, especially when you get like a really big, heavy graphics card in there. It's going to give you a little bit of extra support. So this is where our graphics card is going to install. Now, this top left area is full of heat sinks. So there's not a whole lot you need to worry about here except for these little connectors right here. So you'll see that I have a 8-pin as well as a 4-pin. This is our CPU power that I was talking about earlier. So for a system like this, plug in the 8-pin for sure. That is what is going to provide power to the actual CPU. The 4-pin is auxiliary. You don't need it. I'm gonna do it just for the sake of being complete, but unless you're doing some crazy overclocking or something, typically you don't need that. But if you've got the connectors on your board and the power from your power supply, there's no reason not to do it. So Again, you may have only a 4-pin here, you may have an 8, you have an 8+4, you may have an 8+8 if you have a super high-end board. As long as you have one 8-pin in there, that's usually enough, but you can fully fill it out if you would like. To the right-hand side, we're gonna have a bunch of smaller connectors. So you're gonna see that we have 3 different headers. So these are, that's very sticky. These are fan headers. So you'll see they're actually labeled. So we have CPU fan, CPU optional, and system fan 1. So 4-pin connectors, I'll go over it when we're actually installing them, but this is how fans are connected. So for us, we will plug in our CPU fan. The optional is if you have something like an all-in-one, which is going to provide continuous power to the pump. They all use the same connector. Now, there are 2 different types of fans. There's 4-pin and 3-pin, but they can all go into 4 pins. So you'll see there's this little notch right here. So if you do the 3-pin, it'll just go around the notch. If you have a 4-pin, it just expands over that side. So much like pretty much everything in a PC, fan headers are only going to go in one way. So if you try to put it in there and it doesn't look right, there's a couple of notches to guide you into place. There's a bunch of other stuff that's not super relevant. So you're gonna see some things like LEDs and RGB controllers. I will tell you that while RGB is great and makes your system look awesome, it is outside the scope of this tutorial for one reason. It's real annoying. So look, RGB as an ecosystem is a mess. There are tons of standards, tons of brands, tons of varieties of things that work together that can be daisy chained. It's honestly a mess. If you would like to install RGB fans, RGB strips, whatever the case is in your system, I would implore you to look up tutorials for that specific thing because none of them are the same. Some use chroma, some use RGB, some use Mystic Light. It's a whole thing. Honestly, I don't typically install a lot of RGB entirely because it's a pain. If you want to make your system look awesome, by all means go for it. You can plug it directly into the board. There are also like little add-on things that you can do depending on like if you're gonna use like a little third-party controller or whatever, but like it's annoying and I don't like to deal with it because I just want my PC to work and I don't need it to be in full rainbow parade all the time. Also, I think the fans in the system are gonna do that by default without me doing anything, so. Directly on the right of your board, you should see the 20+4-pin connector. So this is that cable that is gonna come from the power supply. So that's the big chunky guy. This provides power to the entire motherboard. Very important. No matter what other stuff you have on your system, you're always going to populate this 20+4. Very important. It'll click all the way in. I'll show you in a little bit, but it is very straightforward. Coming down a little bit farther, you're gonna see some other random things. So we have another fan header here. It is actually a good idea while you're looking at the board outside of the case to just take quick stock of where fan headers are. So typically you'll have them in a few different areas. So usually there'll be some up toward the top, usually 1 or 2 on the right side, 1 or 2 on the bottom. It depends where they are. Higher end boards typically have more headers, but just kind of have a general idea of where these are because once you have this in the actual case, you're gonna wanna run fans to whatever port that is closest so you don't have like ugly cables like running across. Just something to pay attention to. Now, down here on the right, now this could be anywhere. They tend to be on the right side, but this is a USB-C connector. So if you have an older motherboard or a case that doesn't support USB-C, don't worry about this, but this case does have a USB-C port, and that is something we're going to plug in right here. It looks like, well, ironically, it looks a little bit like a USB-A port, so I'll show you how to install it in a minute. But again, just while we're going through the board, take a mental note of where these various things are. Now, along the right side, you're gonna see we have 4 SATA data connectors. Now, if you're not using a hard drive, an optical drive, or a SATA SSD, you do not actually need to use these. This is a little bit of an older connector. You used to have a ton of these on motherboards. Now a lot of boards only have 2 or 4. If you're gonna install a bunch of like hard drives and stuff, you'll wanna take advantage of these. We are going to plug 1 hard drive in here, but again, it is going to be an additional bit of data for your storage that's gonna be right here on the right side of the board. But sometimes it could be on the bottom, off to the side, whatever, but it's right here. Also along the right side, we have our USB 3.0 header. Now, this is not my favorite connector. I'll show you when we actually install it. It's fine, it powers the front USB ports on our case. Almost all boards and cases are going to have this. It's a really annoying connector purely because you can install it fine. But when you ever need to take it out of the system, I've broken a lot of these over the years. It's just real fiddly. The plastic tends to crack and snap because it's just in there so firmly. Ideally, plug that one in toward the end once you know everything works real good, because it's just annoying. But yeah. Bottom right, we have our front panel connectors. I will give a special thank you to Gigabyte for color coding these. A lot of motherboards over the years have had no easy way to see what's up. So these are a bunch of individual connectors. Again, I'll show you when we actually install it later, but just to know where they are. These are individual connectors for lots of random bits and bobs on your case. These are things like your power button, the reset button, your hard drive LED, just lots of little bits and bobs that you are going to want to use. If you look closely, this one is nicely labeled. So you see our power LED, hard drive, reset, yada, yada, yada. It's very nice to have this right here. If you don't have a nice little legend to show you what everything is, you can always look at your motherboard manual and it will give you the pinouts. Again, I'll explain this later, just pointing out where it is right now. We also have another fan header here and a couple of USB 2.0. So if you have a case that has USB 2.0 ports instead of or in addition to USB 3 ports, you plug these in here. These days though, they're actually a little bit more common for use in sort of internal things. So for example, sometimes like all-in-one pump will actually have a USB 2.0 header that you'll plug into. It just depends, but this board has two of them. You may not need them based on the build. Sometimes you use one, sometimes you use both. And then there's a couple of other things that are not super important. We have like our audio, which I will explain in a minute, but honestly, that's the most important things on this board. The only other thing I'm going to mention now before we actually start building here is over here on the backside. This is our AIO shield. So this is basically all of the ports that are going to be poking out the back of the case. So you look at the back of the case, you see this little slot here. This is where the AIO shield goes. So all of these ports are accessible to you on the outside of the system. And again, every board is going to be a little different. The nice thing about this board and most relatively high-end boards is that this is actually already one piece. If you're getting a little bit more of an affordable board, this little metal piece will actually come separately, usually in the actual box itself. So you'll need to click that into the actual case. I'll tell you, it's really nice when it's already installed here on your motherboard because you just need to slide it right in. But you can see here we've got a bunch of ports. So we have our Wi-Fi, USB, PS2, Ethernet, you name it, it's all on here. It's really easy. That, my friends, unless I'm forgetting something, it's pretty much everything we have on the board. You can see on this one, there's really nothing on the back, so this is gonna be mounted directly onto the actual case. The only other thing I'll mention while I'm here is just the difference between AMD and Intel sockets for the CPU. Since we're using an AMD Ryzen 7000 system, it's very straightforward. So we're gonna push this little arm back. I'm just gonna unlock it, and I'm just gonna pick this up gently. So you'll see that there are a ton of little pins on the actual motherboard. Now, I'm gonna give you a word of warning for anything when it comes to building your computer. It would be this: don't touch these pins. There's a lot of them, they're really small, and if you're using your screwdriver in this area, you're moving your finger around, you start bending these, you're gonna be in for a real bad time very quickly. Now, it's fine if you're careful, but most things in the system, you can make a little mistake, you can drop something, whatever, it's fine, right? You bend some of these pins, you can technically get them back. I've done it in the past, but it really, really sucks. So I would just give you a forewarning, be careful with these pins. Now, this is an AM5 socket, which looks very different because you can see that it actually has that sort of little slash in the middle. So you can see there's pins on the top and pins on the bottom. Now, if you're using an older AMD system, so something with an AM4 socket, for example, there's actually no pins here. The pins are on the CPU itself. So instead, it's sort of flipped, right? So I'll show you my CPU really quick. So on the backside of the CPU, there's just a bunch of pads that connect to these pins. But on older AMD systems, it's reversed. So you would have pins on the CPU, pads on the actual motherboard. Same concept, there are little pins there. Don't touch them, don't mess them up, or you're gonna be in a world of hurt. So that's just a little heads up. Intel motherboards are very similar. It looks a little different than this, but the pins are on the board itself. So just please be careful. I'll show you how to install the CPU in a second, but just if you mess these pins up, you're gonna not, you can try to fix them, but it's really hard. You may need to actually swap out your board. So that's a word of warning, my friends. Be careful with pins. They're sharp and, importantly, a huge pain to put back in place. It is time to install our CPU. Now again, I'm using a Ryzen 7000 series processor. Installing pretty much every CPU is the exact same. So there's slight variations as far as when you actually go to install them, like how they're like mounted and stuff, but it's a very, very similar process. So I'm going to take this out of the box. Now, because this is a Ryzen 7, a little bit more of a higher end chip, that's all I've got in the box. So if I had a lower end chip, it would typically come with the stock cooler. And like I mentioned earlier, those stock coolers are totally fine. But when you get the higher end chip, it comes in a smaller box and only the CPU. It's like when you buy a phone and it doesn't come with the power cable anymore, even though you paid $1,000 for it. You know who you are. So we're going to open up this little plastic clamshell. Now, when it comes to CPU, this is a little bit sensitive. It's not too bad. You do need to be a bit careful if this is an older AMD chip. So again, like a Ryzen 5000 and AM4 chip. Be careful because that has pins on the bottom. This does not. So if I flip it over here, you'll see that on the bottom of the chip, there are all of our little pads. So this is what makes contact with all the pins on the motherboard. You don't want to touch these, but it's not super, super critical. Like you're not gonna, it's fine. Just don't get it dirty and it's all right. Now you'll see that with Ryzen 7000, it has this sort of interesting design where it almost looks like a crown. Most chips will look vaguely similar. So if this was an Intel CPU, it would actually be a little bit taller. And if you're with like an older AM4, it would be a little bit flatter, a little bit more boring. But again, pretty much every CPU is going to look quite similar. And installing them is also basically the same sort of thing. So I've already done it here, but you can see that when you get the motherboard, you would want to push down the arm. So it's either on this side or this side, depending on which socket you've got. You want to pull it back, and then gently we're going to lift up the little lid. So if I've already taken off this little plastic protector, you can actually leave it on because it's designed to pop loose as you close it down, but I just pulled this off so we get a little bit of a clearer shot. Now, when it comes to installing the CPU on AM5, it is very, very simple. So not only are there a couple of notches, so you'll see there's a notch on top and bottom, which corresponds to a notch on top and bottom of the CPU, but it's especially easy because if you flip it over, you'll see that there is the little line, right? So we have the top and the bottom of the chip. That line denotes top and bottom on both the actual socket and the CPU. So this is super simple. If you're using Intel or an older AMD, you're gonna wanna go by the little notches. So there'll be notches on the left or the right or the top or the bottom. And you'll also see that with this and most CPUs, there's gonna be a little gold triangle. That gold triangle will also denote the little triangle on the socket. So there's a number of ways to double check, but just make sure that it lines up correctly. When we drop this in, we're going to gently place it. If you go to put your CPU in and it fights you at all, stop. That's not good. It's supposed to gently rest into place, okay? So it's scary. It's probably the only part of the system that is actually a real danger, but it's totally fine. So to install the CPU, very simple. Hold it by the corners, try to touch that bottom, just good general rule of thumb. We're going to line it up with our actual socket, making sure that it is lined up correctly with those notches, and we're gonna gently let go of it. Ta-da! That's it. You see how it just rests very, very seamlessly here? Again, if you go to put that in there and it doesn't feel right, don't wiggle it, don't force it, gently pick it up, visually inspect that the notches are lined up and everything is fine. As you can see, it just rests completely fine. Once you know that it is in here, you can put your finger out and just give it a little wiggle just to make sure, totally fine. Then we're going to take the top of it, put it underneath this little retention, so you'll see that we'll actually have to make sure it's all the way forced down there. And then we take this arm and give it some good force. It's gonna be a little hard to put down, but don't worry about it. It's just a moderate amount of force. And congratulations, you have a CPU installed in your motherboard. That's it. It's that simple. It seems scary. There's a lot of things that could go wrong, but as long as you put the CPU on, it is lined up correctly, you put that arm down, that's it. That is really the most nerve-wracking part of any PC build. At this point, it gets much, much less scary. Next up, let's install our RAM. So for this system, I'm going to be installing dual channel memory, which is going to come in 2 DIMMs. So to install RAM, it is very simple. If you've ever worked on a PC in the past, odds are it was probably installing RAM. So you're hopefully familiar, but if not, so simple. So I'm gonna pull it out of the little clamshell here. RAM is not super fragile. You don't have to worry about it too much. So almost all RAM these days has like a little metal heatsink, which is perfectly safe to hold. Now, it's just a good general rule of thumb. You see like little gold contacts on pretty much anything, don't touch them. It's okay, you just don't wanna get them dirty, you wanna get them like gross or nasty or anything. So typically it's always safe to grab these things by the sides or by like the little metal shrouds. But you'll see that I have 2 sticks of DDR5 here. Now I actually have right here a stick of DDR4. So if you're building a system, you're gonna be using one of these types of memory. They look almost the exact same, but importantly, they're not compatible with each other. So if you're building an Intel system, oftentimes Intel systems will actually have an option. So the CPUs would support DDR4 or DDR5, and it's down to which motherboard you get, but a motherboard will only select one of these 2. So this board actually says right here, and it's Ryzen 7000, so you know it's DDR5. Same thing as if you buy an Intel board, it will tell you DDR4 or DDR5. The main reason I say that is because while they look similar, they're not the same. If I try to take DDR4 and put it in a DDR5 board, it will not fit, and vice versa with DDR5. And the main reason for that, put them side by side, you see that there's a little notch. It's about halfway through or so. That notch is in a different spot for DDR4 versus DDR5. That is the only physical thing stopping you from trying to make a real bad mistake. So if you've made it somehow to this point and you're not sure, double check that your DDR4 or DDR5 RAM is correct for your DDR4 or DDR5 motherboard. Sounds like it's very complicated. It really isn't. If you're building with Ryzen 7000, you're definitely using DDR5. If you're building with Ryzen 5000 or earlier, you're definitely using DDR4. If you're building with Intel, it could be either or. Reference what kind of motherboard you have. That will tell you what kind of RAM you need to use. But because we're using Ryzen 7000, it's very straightforward. Now, regardless of what kind of RAM you're using, installing this is dead simple. A2 and B2 it says first. That is very common. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna pull back these little retention arms. So you'll see you just pull it back on one side, on the other side. We're gonna do it on slot 2 and 4. Some motherboards actually only allow you to open one of the sides. If that's the case, it's fine, but you'll always at least open one of them. And then with our RAM in hand, what we're gonna do is we're gonna line it up. So there's no easy way of telling which way it is. I'll be honest, just look at the notch and just sort of do a little test fit and see. So you'll see that does fit. You'll see that does fit. There we go. I still put the RAM in wrong almost every time. So you know how I mentioned that you got that little notch? Well, it's almost halfway, but not quite. And visually it's hard to tell. So what I do every time is I just come a little lower, I line up in the slot, making sure that you have actually opened the correct arms, so it's easy to accidentally like kind of cross it. So make sure that you've actually got it. Slot 2, right? So it's gonna line up. Gonna line up here. Look at where that notch is, and you'll see that it matches up correctly. I can now click this into place. If, however, I roll the dice wrong and put it in backwards, what you would see is that that notch does not line up, and this will not go into place, right? So if you feel it, obviously, and it just physically doesn't look it actually matches, just flip the stick around. It's totally fine. It's just, because it's almost half and not halfway through, it's really hard for me to visually tell which side it is, so I always just actually look down, do a very light little test fit to make sure it does line up, which I can see it is, and at that point, take a thumb on either corner and give it a relatively decent amount of pressure until you hear it click. So ready, set, 1, and boom. There we go, we got 1 stick of RAM installed. That simple. So because I have the 2 sticks of RAM, I'm going to go to my 4th slot, do the exact same thing, making sure that I have lined it up correctly. So again, there's a little guide there, so it should line up relatively well. 1, 2, and we're gonna push and push. There we go. We have ourselves 32 gigabytes of RAM installed. Now, if you had 4 sticks of RAM, if you're Mr. Moneybags over here, you would just continue to populate all the slots. But if you're doing dual channel memory with just 2 DIMMs, which is the majority of systems, you're gonna put those 2 in. There we go. That's it. Super, super straightforward. Like honestly, even if you've never built a PC before, you could just install RAM in your existing system. Like it is very simple. Just don't push it really hard if it doesn't go in, because you probably have it upside down. And again, I do that a lot. So just, this is a little outside the scope of the tutorial, but just a little tip. So I'm using a kit of G.Skill Flare X5. So these are 2 identical sticks of RAM. Technically, any set of DDR5 would work, but I don't recommend it. So if I were to say, expand this RAM to 64 gigabytes and buy 2 more, I wanna buy the exact same kit of RAM. Mostly because this RAM is all gonna be running at the same speed, same timing, same everything. That is a pretty much guaranteed way of expanding your memory. If I was to say, grab a set of Corsair RAM that's a little slow or whatever, the system will work, but it will default to whatever the lowest speed is, and sometimes it'll default to like base speeds. You also can sometimes have compatibility issues. Most modern systems it will work, but if you're going to expand your memory, try to buy the exact same kit that you have. So it might not be a bad idea. So this is just a little pamphlet that came in the plastic sleeve. It might not be a bad idea to just keep this handy. So say 6 months or a year, 2 years from now, if you want to buy some more RAM, you can confirm that you're getting the exact same thing. So again, it's not just necessarily the manufacturer, but it's the speeds, the timing, it's everything. If you're doing troubleshooting, RAM is the spot that I always like to start with. So especially if you've got mismatched RAM in there, that can sometimes cause compatibility issues. So If you get this thing all put together, you hit the power button and nothing happens, check your RAM, make sure it's seated, make sure you have all matching sticks. And if it really doesn't work, what I'll actually do sometimes is I will remove one of the sticks of RAM and try to post it that way. You shouldn't actually run your computer like this because you're losing performance, but if you're just doing a little bit of troubleshooting, trying with a single stick of RAM can sometimes actually fix the issue. Every once in a while, the stick of RAM may be dead or it's not seated right or whatever the case is. So just a little tip for troubleshooting and future expansion. But for now, we're gonna install both of our sticks and we're gonna move on to our SSD. So we are of course using a Samsung 990 Pro, but this is an NVMe SSD and they're all going to install the exact same way. So the 990 Pro is a very high-end SSD. This thing will do what, like 7,000 megabytes per second? Like it is absurdly fast. Like I'll be real with you, almost every NVMe SSD you could install is gonna be just silly fast, right? The thing I do tend to like is going with Samsung SSDs for reliability. Now, you have to be a little careful when it comes to picking a brand for reliability because everyone's different. Every SSD, every manufacturer, every line, right? Samsung make a number of different SSDs, for example. So the safe bet is always to read some reviews and see, but I just personally speaking have had a lot of good luck with Samsung SSDs in the past. So again, your mileage may vary. Every company has quality control issues sometimes, yada, yada, yada. But I tend to like Samsung because not only are they fairly fast and usually on the cutting edge, they make all their own stuff, but importantly, I have never had a Samsung SSD fail on me, actually. I don't think I've ever had a problem with it. So, you know, obviously plenty of options out there, but it's good to have a high quality SSD so that you don't, you know, lose data, because that's not fun. When it comes to installing our SSD, it is very simple. So we're gonna go to our top PCI slot, which again is the one that had this little cover on it. So if you can't find it, you may need to take one of these covers off. And what we're gonna do is, if you look at the SSD, you'll see it has a bunch of little gold pens with a little notch, right? So the notch denotes where the power and the data are split. So with this, it is only gonna go in one way. There is technically another type of M2 SSD, which is based on SATA, and that will have an additional notch up here. Those are less common and honestly kind of out of date at this point. So the vast majority of you should buy an NVMe SSD as opposed to a SATA M2 SSD, which is word soup. But if you have the second notch, you'll just need to make sure that your motherboard has a slot that supports SATA SSDs. But like I said, 95% of you buying an SSD should get just a regular NVMe M2 SSD, at which point you should have no compatibility issues. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take it, we're gonna line it up with this little slot here. So when we line it up, we're going to do it at just a little bit of an angle. So just give it a little wiggle. You'll feel it start to go in, and then you can let go. It will stay like that, and the next step is to go to those little screws that came with the motherboard. And you'll see that there's a little baggie here that has one baby screw in it. They give them to you separately, not sure why, but these SSD screws that you're gonna need are going to come with the motherboard. Now, some motherboards actually don't need the screw. This one does, but sometimes you'll actually have a little plastic piece that goes on this, and all you'll do is you'll just push this down and rotate the plastic piece down, because all it's doing is just physically holding it in place. So depending on the manufacturer of your motherboard, you may use one of these little screws that comes with your motherboard, or you might just have a little plastic piece that just swivels around and holds it. Both are totally fine. It takes 5 seconds to put one screw in, but it is so simple. Like honestly, compared to, we'll show you how to do a hard drive in a little bit, but compared to installing a hard drive, it's not exactly a tough thing to do. But man, M2 SSDs are so easy. I mean, it is just, it's so good. Before we screw it in, I'm just gonna make sure that the SSD is fully seated. So I'm gonna put a little bit of pressure toward the socket. It's nice and firm in there. So I'm gonna take my finger and push it down, grab my screwdriver, take the screw like this, and then I'm going to screw it into place. And just like that, we have an SSD installed. I told you, it is really, really simple. So before we're done, we're just gonna give it a little push test just to make sure it's not loose in any way. Another troubleshooting thing, if you have problems later on, sometimes you may be able to actually get the computer to post and go into the BIOS, but your SSD won't show up. Almost always your problem is that you didn't fully seat it. Typically, if the screw goes in, nice and cleanly, you do have that fully seated, but just as a heads up, if you have any problems with your SSD showing up later, now would be a great time to come back in, make sure your screw's all the way tight, and make sure that it is fully seated in there. Because if it's out even just a little bit, it sometimes might not show up. But I mean, that's it. It's not very complicated. The last thing we need to do here is install this little cover. Now, strictly speaking, you don't actually have to use these. So the reason why it's this sort of big metal cover is actually a heatsink for your SSD. Now, I highly recommend this. You should definitely use this because it comes with the board. You'll see on the back side, so this is like the front, so this is the back. So if you peel off this little piece of plastic, you'll actually see that it is a little thermal pad. So if you touch it, a little sticky. This is actually meant to transfer heat from the SSD onto your heatsink and let it be dissipated in your case. Again, I would definitely recommend to do this. Your system will run without a heatsink usually, but just don't do that. Just put the heatsink on. It is gonna help your SSD perform far better. It's gonna be much more of a long, happy life, and it's already on your motherboard almost certainly, so it's kind of a bit of a no-brainer. All of these heatsinks can be slightly different based on your motherboard, but with this one, it's really straightforward. So this little notch, which is gonna go into where the socket is, and then there's a screw on the other side. The only thing I'll say as far as installing these, because this is a sticky thermal pad, try to do this cleanly the first time. You don't be wiggling around or whatever, because it'll actually like tug your SSD. So just make sure that you get it nice and cleanly. So I'm gonna try to do this in one try. So I'm gonna take our heatsink, we're gonna line it up with the top of the socket here. So it just slides in like so. I'm gonna actually get a little lower so I can get a nice view of it. So it should make nice, smooth, and even contact with our SSD. And it's gonna be hard for you to see, but there's this little screw hole right here. So I'm gonna make sure that that is making contact with our actual screw. And with that, I'm going to gently put it into place. You can go ahead and screw this pretty much all the way down. Once I'm done, I like to take my finger and just sort of run it along a time or two just to make sure that it has made some good contact. And that's it. Your SSD is installed. It has a full nice heatsink on it to make sure it's nice and cool. If you ever need to take your SSD out, swap it out, that's fine. Just keep in mind that because that thermal pad's a little sticky, you don't want to do that too much. You don't want to touch that too much because it will start to lose some of the effect. But that's it, my friends. We got ourselves a CPU installed. We got ourselves RAM installed. We've got ourselves an SSD installed. You can take a little bit of a break now. Maybe do a little stretch. Did you drink some water? You probably need to drink some water because we're about to go into the next phase, which is to install our motherboard into the case. We're gonna start installing our graphics card, our cooler, all the kind of fun stuff. But here's a great point for you to take a little break and pat yourself on the back because you've actually made a lot of progress. Good job. Now, my friends, it is time to retrieve our case and set it down on the desk. So you're gonna put it down flat on its bottom, or its back, I guess, because we're going to install our motherboard. So I will admit, a big reason why I'm using a white case right now is because it is a lot easier to see. Now, that is because I'm doing a tutorial. Obviously, you pick whatever case you want. I will just give you a little heads up. If you have chosen a black case, it's a little hard to see sometimes. I would recommend, if you do not have a well-lit area, pull out your phone and your flashlight. Sometimes, like again, with this white case and the studio light, it's really easy to see, but there's definitely times when I'm building in a black case, especially once you start getting a bunch of components in, it can be hard to sort of see like some of the areas where you're gonna like run cables or standoffs or whatever. So just a little like sort of heads up as you're sort of either planning your build or actually getting started. Make sure you have a well-lit area. And if you've got a white case, it's a lot easier to see. So just a little tip there. But let's install our motherboard. Before you install your motherboard, you want to make sure your IO shield is in place. So again, this motherboard has an IO shield already attached to the board, so I don't have to do this, but a lot of other boards don't. So I'll show you a clip of our previous PC tutorial where you have to install the IO shield. Essentially, it's just a little piece of metal that clicks into place in this sort of back part of the chassis. Now, you want to make sure that is fully seated. You also want to make sure that it is in the correct orientation. You just want to make sure that the IO shield matches up with the layout of the ports on the back of your motherboard. Trust me when I say you want to make sure that IO shield is in correctly, because if you don't, and you put your motherboard in and you screw it all down, and then you look at the back and realize none of your ports are sticking out, you're gonna be real grumpy. Not that I've ever done that or anything. But if your board already has the IO shield in, congratulations, that step's already done. So, assuming you have your IO shield installed, it is time to put the motherboard in. So, motherboards are fairly straightforward. Now, this is the point where I will tell you to check the size of your motherboard and the size of your case. So this is, again, an ATX chassis and an ATX board, which means that thankfully, I already have my standoffs installed. So you can see that I have 9 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That is a standard ATX configuration. Now, if I was using a smaller motherboard, I would only be using maybe 4, 6, 8. It depends on the board, especially micro ATX sometimes has slightly different positioning. So if you're using a different sized motherboard, check the manual for your case. Sometimes the case will actually have like M or ATX or ITX engraved. Typically though, you want to take a look at your actual manual to see. The idiot-proof way of doing it is to just test fit your motherboard. So you can see with this ATX board, I should just be able to drop it right into place and I will be able to see that everything lines up. So I'm just gonna line it up something like this. And I can already visually see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 screw holes. So I know that this will line up. But if you're, again, using a micro ATX motherboard and an ATX chassis, you may need to install or move some standoffs. Which brings me to this box of hardware. So every case is a little different. So this is a Lee & Lee case, which has a large amount of accessories in it, but you're always going at this point want to find the box of stuff that came in your case. Usually it's a little small in this, sometimes it's like in like your little hard drive caddy. There's a bunch of stuff in here, including a manual, which you may want to check if you have any questions, especially again when it comes to the positioning of where you want standoffs. But what I'm looking for is this little guy right here. So this is a little box of hardware. So if I can do this without dumping it all over the place, you'll see that I have a bunch of different types of screws and mounts and all that kind of thing. This is very helpful. In fact, not just very helpful, it's a necessity because these are where you're gonna find screws to mount most of the components in your system, including your motherboard. So because I am using an ATX case and an ATX motherboard, my standoffs are already here. If I'm using a different size, or some cases don't have this, I need to actually manually install these standoffs myself. So if I look through here, normally what you'll find, so you'll see that this is a little bag that has a bunch of screws and standoffs. Now, sometimes these standoffs are actually bronze, so they're actually made out of brass. The whole point of a standoff is to separate your motherboard from actually grounding itself on the case, and you just need a place to screw it in. Also, just a little heads up, as you open these little baggies, be real careful. They explode all over the place. I have lost, like, you wanna lose one of these in your carpet? I don't think so. So this is what a standoff looks like. So you can see that it has a little thread on the top, and then if I flip it over, you'll see it has a thread on the bottom. So this is what goes into the case, and then this is where your screw will go into the actual standoff through the motherboard. A lot of this stuff is very small, so I'll admit it's a little hard to get on camera, so I'll try to show you as much as possible. But again, my standoffs are already installed in this case. If you do need to install standoffs, so I'll just show you, like say I'll put one right here. What I like to do is I like to start it finger tight, so you can get it kind of in there. You want to make sure as you install standoffs that you get them in there pretty firmly, because what can happen is that say I install this one just finger tight and I call it a day. Finger tight's actually enough to install your motherboard, but what can happen is that say you need to replace your motherboard, you need to pull it out at some point. If this is not all the way seated into the case, when you go to unscrew the screw out of your actual motherboard, instead of coming out, it'll just spin the standoff and it'll get stuck. And at that point, you have to get like a pair of pliers in there. It's a huge pain. So I would highly recommend to make sure this is nice and tight. There's a couple ways to make sure that you install these correctly. So most of the time, not always, most of the time you'll have this little tool. I don't know if it actually has an official name, but I would just call it the standoff tool. And basically this is on the top, it's going to be a little Phillips bit, and on the bottom is going to be a little hex. I'll show you how to do this just for simplicity's sake. So I'm gonna take my bit and put it over the standoff, and then I'm going to screw it in pretty tightly. So don't go crazy on it or anything. That's magnetic, so it comes back up. But that is the way to properly install a standoff. And same thing, if the standoffs that are already in your case don't match up for whatever reason, you can use this tool to remove a standoff as well. With this tool, it is very straightforward to install and remove standoffs based on what you need for your board. I will say that these are usually, but not always, included with your case hardware. If you don't have one of these, you actually can use a little pair of pliers to crank them down and sort of pull them back out. I don't like doing that if I can avoid it, because you can't always get it all the way in there and it's a little bit more annoying. And that's the only time you ever really do need pliers. But just a little heads up, if maybe you're working on your PC later and you lose this little guy or something, you can use a pair of pliers to do it. But just, if you're installing standoffs, make sure you've got them in there nice and firm. Because trust me, you'll get them in there halfway, you'll install your motherboard, 2 years will go by, you'll try to take your board out and you realize that your screw and your standoff are just spinning and you're gonna really regret your decisions. So just make sure you get those things all the way in there. But for this video, we actually don't need to do that. All the standoffs are in there and it is time to install the board itself. The only other thing I'll say as I start to line the board up here is that you may want to install your all-in-one liquid cooler before you do your motherboard. I will mention that there are two different schools of thought as far as the order of operations at this point. So I'm going to show you how to install the motherboard and then the CPU cooler. Now, if you're using something like an air cooler, this is definitely what you want to do, right? And I'll show you that in just a second. But because this system, we're using a all-in-one liquid cooler, so we're going to have a radiator and some fans that are mounted up top. Sometimes you actually want to do this in the opposite order and install your radiator and your fans first and then your motherboard. I unfortunately don't have a foolproof recommendation. It does kind of come down to your actual case. It comes down to how big of a cooler you're using, and it comes down to the motherboard. The main reason why you may want to install the cooler first is to be able to actually easily run your cables. So you can see here that there's a few things we're going to need to plug in on the top of the board. So you can imagine that there's going to be a radiator right here and then fans as well. So it's going to actually kind of come out to here. Thankfully, this case has lots of space, so it shouldn't be a huge concern. But certainly some cases that are a little bit more compact, it's really hard to say pull your sort of CPU power connectors up here and plug them in when you've got this huge radiator in the way. So I would just give you a little sort of heads up that you may want to do this slightly out of order compared to what I'm doing. But if you're using an all-in-one cooler that say has it mounted on this side, it's not a problem. So it's like a 120 or 240. If you're mounting it in the front, it's not a problem. And if you are using an air cooler, it's also not a problem. So I'm going to be just installing this the normal sort of way. Before I install the board though, let me just quickly show you the difference between an air and a water cooler. So again, I'm using an AIO, so I'm going to be installing everything up on top. If I was installing an air cooler, it would be mounted something like this. And this might just be a good sort of way of showing you one of the reasons why you may or may not actually want an air cooler. So this is a Be Quiet cooler. It is on the larger side, certainly not the biggest, but the thing with these is I like the simplicity, but they are quite heavy. And when you mount them, you can see because obviously the board is going to be sort of vertically. This is a lot of weight that can be kind of pulling on your system, which is a great reason why you should make sure to use all of the standoffs, all 9 of them on our ATX board, and make sure you screw everything in nice and tightly. I've seen some horror stories of a cooler that's a little heavy, maybe it's being shipped or moved or whatever, and it can rip stuff right out. Now let us install our motherboard. So I'm gonna go through here. I have a bunch of the screws, which I will show you. So the thing is, and you know what, I don't understand why we've been building PCs for however many decades at this point. You don't, at a quick glance, know what screws go to what. Which is weird because a bunch of these screws are very similar sizes. You would think that I don't know, someone would make them different colors or something. Now, if you really want to know, you can go to your manual that comes with your case, and somewhere in here is going to tell you what screws go to what. So right here, it'll tell you all of the different screws that come with your system. As you can see, a lot of these screws look very, very similar. So you can see that this one right here shows screw for motherboard and 2.5-inch SSD. Got a little almost washer looking guy around the corner. So that's the kind of screw we're looking for. Sometimes you can grab a screw that feels almost the exact same thing and it doesn't thread right. If you grab that and it doesn't thread, just grab the other screw. But it's just, I don't know, I feel like we should have slightly more distinct screws because they're so similar. But for our purposes, we're gonna look for 8 and 9 of these little guys. I'm gonna use my little magnetic mat so I don't lose them. And then it is as simple as installing the board. But some cases will have, instead of 9 standoffs, they'll have 8 plus a little peg in the center. That's actually really helpful because when you go to install your board, so you can see right here, you maybe have to zoom in a little bit, but you can see that while it's pretty much in place, it's slightly askew across the board. So what I'm gonna have to actually do is I'm gonna have to adjust it and sort of try to center it up myself. But if you have a case that has one of those little centering pens, that'll actually kind of help to, well, center it by itself. But it's not a big deal. Just expect that when you put the board in, it's not gonna look quite right. You're gonna have to sort of finesse it just a little bit to make sure it all lines up. Now, before we put in any screws, something to keep in mind. Now, this is not really a big problem for this system because it has that IO shield built in. But if you do have a system that you're going to install the IO shield and then sort of slide the motherboard into, so again, usually a little bit of an older or lower end system, take a look around the back. So you see here that I can see all of my ports. They're nice and clear, nice and clean. Perfect. I know that I'm good to go. If I'm using a IO shield and sliding the motherboard in, take a look at that rear IO. Can you see all of your ports? Are there any little metal pegs or pins anywhere? Boy, oh boy, it's not fun to install your board, finish your whole system, get it all ready to go, and then you go to plug your Ethernet in and there's a little metal pin in the way because you didn't notice it. Highly recommend before you put in any screws for your motherboard visually look at every single one of your ports and make sure that it is unobstructed. Just look really close, make sure. Boy, I can't tell you how many times I've had to spend an hour tearing apart my PC just to move one tiny little pin because I wasn't paying attention. Thankfully though, because this system has the AIO Shield integrated, that's basically never a problem because it's quite literally already attached. So just a little warning for first-time builders to don't be doing big dumb things like I have done in the past. To install the motherboard, we're going to use the same sort of cross pattern as we did for our power supply. So pick a corner, doesn't really matter which one. And we're going to start a screw. Now again, because the motherboard, we're just getting it started, it's gonna be a little bit crooked, that's totally fine. Just sort of give it a little bit of pressure and sort of slide it into roughly the position. So I can see right here, I need to give it a little bit of shove to the left side. So it's almost there. There we go. Motherboards don't ever fit quite right out of the box. So like with this, I can see I can actually need to adjust it a little bit more. There we go. All right, so this board wants to fight me a little bit. So I'm gonna start with this top right corner, which is the one that doesn't wanna fit quite right. That's fine, we'll just give it a little bit of encouragement. And we're gonna just tighten that down. When you're doing this, do not tighten it super tight. Just get it started, make sure that it's not gonna like sort of hop off. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to the opposite corner. Again, you always want to install things corner, 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 corner to make sure that you are evenly applying pressure, especially with a motherboard. If I tighten that all the way down, I'm gonna have to still adjust like this back corner to make sure it fits and then tighten it. Otherwise, you're gonna crank that thing all the way down and half your screw holes will not line up. So just do this slowly, do it like a little bit at a time, and then you can make sure that your motherboard is fully seated. Because PC builds have been around for decades, and certain things have improved over the years, but certain things feel like they figured it out in 1984 and they never decided to second guess anything. And installing motherboards really has not evolved a lot. You line it up with the holes, you wiggle it till it fits, and you screw it into place. Which I guess sounds pretty simple, but it's kind of fiddly. Anyway, all right, so I can again visually see that the top right is fine, so I'm gonna go to my bottom left. And again, just gonna do that like half tight, just to make sure it's not going anywhere, but don't get it too tight. And then we're gonna do the top left corner, which I'm gonna give it a little bit of a wiggle, but that also looks like it's fine. And again, only doing it about half tight, just to make sure that it's not gonna wiggle. I still may actually have to give it a little bit of a push to make sure everything lines up, but so far I think we're about there. And then once we've done the four corners, then you can do all the ones in the middle. Just make sure you do all of your screws and standoffs. I mean, you don't technically need to, but I would highly recommend it. Especially because these days, graphics cards can be very heavy. It puts a lot of pressure on these things. And again, if you're ever like moving or shipping your system or whatever, you wanna make sure that you are fully seated. So again, with an ATX motherboard, you're looking for 9 total screws. For micro ATX, it's usually anywhere between 7 and 8, I think, off the top of my head. Mini ATX is typically 4 screws. So just make sure that you're going around, installing everything. All right, cool. So before you tighten everything down, quick idiot check. Again, look at your AIO Shield, make sure all your ports are looking fine. No brainer on this one. Make sure that the board is like obviously not like pinching any cables. So you can see that I have this little fan header up here. So you'll make sure that that's not being like sort of pinched or anything. But as long as everything visually looks fine and we know that nothing needs to move at this point, we can take a screwdriver and tighten down all of our screws and our motherboard will be fully installed in our case. Next up, before we install our CPU cooler, regardless if you're using a liquid cooler or an air cooler, I recommend installing your CPU power. So it is always up here on the top left of the board. Now with this case, we actually have a pretty good amount of clearance, but a lot of cases don't have quite so much. And once you put like radiators or even just a big air cooler in the way, it can sometimes be very hard to reach back here. So I always recommend doing this first. As you run cables, so you'll see right now that even though we have a modular supply, there's just still a lot of stuff here. As you run cables, just try to think about how you position them. There's no real right or wrong way, but you can see that, okay, so if I'm going to install my CPU power connector, so what I'll do is I'll pull these cables out of the way and kind of tuck them on the bottom. Now the main reason to do this is just so that you don't have a bunch of extra sort of thickness. So a little bit later on when we actually do our cable management and put the side panel on, what you want to do is you want to make sure that the cables are sort of diversified. If you have all your cables sort of in a thick like run in the middle, the side panel may not go back on. So for this run, for example, because I know that these are going to go off to the side, I'm going to specifically pull them out of the way, run them through these little cable channels here, which should give us enough length. And then I'm going to run them up here. Now I say that, these might actually not be long enough, but yeah, I think it'll work. So this case specifically has these little cable channels. Oftentimes you won't have that. So you'll see that there are all these little like sort of holes here. So there's like a little gap here, gap here, gap here. These are meant so you can use twist ties. So when you're running your cables, especially a little bit later once you're actually done, you can tie them down. But for now, and just generally speaking, when you're plugging things in, try to think a little bit about the cable run because it's a lot cleaner and a lot smoother if you do this now versus building the whole system and then you have to tear half of it out to figure out where everything goes. So for this, assuming that that is long enough, which I think it should be, I'm gonna poke it through this top left spot here. I think it's gonna be just long enough. Now I might have to pull a little bit of slack. If we turn the case back around, it's easy to do this while the case is mostly empty because when you have to like rotate the case back and forth, it's full of components. I mean, unless you're Jay's 2 cents over here, it's kind of heavy. So you can see that right now, I've run my 2 CPU connectors through this top corner. So you'll see that they're just gonna come right down to here. So what I will do is just make sure that I've got all the slack I can, but it is going to be enough. And what you'll do is you will just plug them in one after the other. So this one is already together. So you see that because I have the 8+4, here's the 8 and here's the 4+4. They can just snap together, but because I only need half of these, I have to separate these before I plug them in. So to install these, it's quite simple. So I'm gonna start with my 8 pin, which is going to go on this side. So there's a little clip on the bottom, which like most things in a computer means it's only going to go in one way. A little hard for me to see and it's probably impossible for you to see, but if I just rotate that around, there we go. That is a nice little click. And honestly, those cables actually look pretty nice. Now I'm gonna do the same thing for the auxiliary power. I'm gonna cheat just a little bit. So because my secondary CPU, I only need 4 of the 8 pins, I'm actually gonna split them. So you'll see they kind of split by themselves. So if I just pull them apart a little bit, I get a little bit, sorry, it's hard to see, but you'll see I got a little bit of extra space. I'm gonna take the extra 4 that I don't need and tuck them back in, and I'm only going to feed the 4 that I actually need. Again, all this is just for aesthetics, but it's gonna make your life a little easier, and importantly, your cable runs to look a little bit neater. Sometimes, especially when you're working in like sort of confined spaces, you kind of have to go off of feel more than anything. This is where you may want to use something like a flashlight, but there we go. That's it. Now we have our CPU power cables connected. The rest of our power cables can come later once we have more components in the system, but I definitely recommend doing this earlier because it's a lot easier when you don't have any obstructions in your way. Now, it is time to install our CPU cooler. We are taking advantage of a 360mm all-in-one radiator, pump, fan, the whole deal, right? Everything you need to cool your CPU is in this box. Now, a couple of things to go over before we do this. First of all, this is quite a high-end setup. Now, if you really are going in depth on PC building, you want to do a full like custom loop or something, by all means. But I think most people who are watching this tutorial are probably not going to be doing a custom hardline liquid cooling loop for their first system. So this is a much more straightforward plug and play kind of method. However, it's quite a lot for this system. Now it will fit. It's a 360mm radiator, which means that we have 3 120mm fans, which will be mounted here, here, and here. It'll all go together nicely. It will fit in this case, but I'll be honest, it's quite overkill for our Ryzen 7 7700X. I mean, it'll be nice and cool, but if I was not doing this for tutorial purposes, I would probably pick maybe a 240mm radiator at the most for this system, but I'm gonna show you what it looks like when we do the entire 360mm setup. So this is going to be about as big of a AIO that you would ever install. Technically, they make slightly bigger ones, but they're quite rare. Like this is it's a big boy, and importantly, it does have the screen on the front. Now, while I'll be showing you how to install this AIO, you of course could be using an air cooler. Now, these come in a bunch of different sizes and varieties. In fact, that goes for all CPU coolers. Almost no CPU cooler is the same as another one when it comes to the install. So if you're using this exactly in Lee, I'll show you how to do it. You can see that if this was a CPU cooler, it would go on something like that. And you can see that if that was in there, we would have very little space up here. But for these purposes, we're going to be going with this AIO. All right, I think that's enough preamble. Let's crack this open and begin the install. It is not super difficult, but also one of my least favorite parts of building a PC. It's fine. AIOs, there's nothing against them, right? Like they certainly have their advantages, as we've already discussed. The main downside is just the fact that there's a lot of components because there's 3 individual fans, there's the radiator, then there's the pump, and you want to make sure that that's all there. There's also a lot of cables involved. Like, this is 100% doable if this is your first system. I don't want to scare you off at all, but an air cooler is certainly a lot easier to install, I will tell you that. Now, before I actually go into this, it's really not a problem. but I will mention it anyway. You'll see right here, it says Intel LGA 1700 and AMD AM5 supported. Now, generally speaking, CPU coolers are pretty universal. Now, they may not be powerful enough or sort of efficient enough to sort of get rid of a bunch of heat if you have like a little dinky air cooler and you put it on like a really powerful processor, but usually they will physically mount. And that especially goes for the stock coolers, which if you're using a stock cooler, typically they just clip right on or attach. They're super easy to install. Now, when it comes to third-party coolers, it is worth a quick check to make sure that it is going to be compatible with your socket. So because this is an AM5 motherboard, this is an AM5 socket. If we were using Intel, it would be LGA 1700. There are a lot of older sockets that are also included. I only mention this because a year or two ago, actually it was maybe 2-3 years ago at this point, Intel changed their socket for the first time in a very long time. It was a physically different size, and a lot of CPU coolers did not have compatibility with it for 6 months, 12 months as they were sort of changing because you need like a little different plate. So it's not really a problem today. AM5 is super easy. And again, pretty much anything you should buy in 2024 will support 1700, but it's probably worth a quick little check just to make sure. But you shouldn't have any problems unless you're using maybe like an older cooler from like an older build or something, in which case you may need some kind of like adapter bracket, which most companies sell, but it's not quite universal. So just a little heads up on that. All right, we got ourselves the all-important instruction manual, which is really thin. Oh, that's okay. Well, you know what? They're very confident because that's not a lot of stuff. Wow. These are usually several pages. So that's all the instructions we need. Hold on to these. I will show you how to do this, but let me be very clear. Every CPU cooler installs differently, which is not helpful when I make a tutorial on how to install a CPU cooler. So I'm gonna show you the broad strokes. And if you wanna go with this one, you obviously can by all means go for it, but just keep in mind, get a Corsair, if you get a Lian Li, you get a MSI, they're all gonna be a little different. Probably the same, but a little different. All right, what you will find with every AIO are your fans and your radiator, which are already installed. Oh my God, are they already installed? Yo, that's awesome! So this is actually the newer version of the Lian Li coolers. These used to be called the Galahats. I think they've just rebranded to the GA2s, or at least I think so. This is the first time I've used it. Oh my God, that's so good. Okay, so remember that whole thing about how every CPU cooler is different? Yeah, they already installed the fans for me. Normally, you get your 2, your 3 fans or whatever, and they're in the box and you have to connect them. And it's got USB-C on the pump too. This, Lian Li, I'm glad I went with it. I was like not sure what I was gonna use for this tutorial. This is great. Okay, well, I'll quickly show you what you would theoretically do if you were using a non-Lian Li cooler. So if I take off all this plastic, you'll see here that this part right here is the radiator. It's actually very similar to like a radiator in your car or something. So this is where the liquid's going to flow through, and the fans are going to push air through that radiator, essentially to dissipate the heat, right? So the way this works is actually pretty neat. So this is our pump, so you can see that, if I flip it over, this will be the screen that you'll see when it's actually installed. And on the back, there's this sort of, oh, they've got the thermal paste on there too? God damn, Lian Li, what, y'all are out here, man, y'all are out here. Okay, well, this could be a really simple install. I'm used to doing like half the stuff myself. Okay. The way this works is pretty straightforward. So your CPU generates a whole bunch of heat. So that is moved through this thermal paste, which usually you have to do yourself, but it is already pre-applied here, which is very helpful. And then that is on a copper heat sink. So all that heat comes through the copper, and then it gets dissipated by the liquid that runs through the pump. So the pump is constantly circulating. So basically what it does is it runs the liquid through here, across, in through all these sort of veins of the actual radiator, in through the radiator, and then the air blows that heat away. Again, if we were using an air cooler, it is even more straightforward. The heat comes through here, runs through these heat pipes, gets blown out. Super simple. Actually not wildly different between the two. The difference is this does not need any kind of like actual pump or anything. It just needs the actual fan to run. Whereas with this, you need to make sure that this has power. So there's a lot of extra assembly steps when it comes to attaching the fans, attaching the pump, attaching the RGB, all this kind of stuff. We also have a bunch of accessories which we will almost certainly need, although fewer than we normally would. So I'm gonna show you what you would normally do, which is to screw your fans into place. So because these are already on here, it makes it really simple. But typically what you'll do is you will take your fans and you will put them on the bottom of your radiator. So let me just kind of mock it up and show you what it's gonna look like once we're done. If you were so unfortunate as to be using a cooler that does not have the fans applied, it's pretty straightforward. So you're gonna have a whole bunch of these longer screws. And so basically what this does is once you actually lay it down on your cooler, now you can technically do it either in a push or a pull configuration. if you're using RGB fans, you're pretty much always going to be doing it in a push configuration. So you're basically going to be pushing the air from here out. So technically you could do it the other direction. Maybe if you were to say put your cooler in like the front or something. Almost everyone's gonna put it on the top these days. That's really what they're kind of designed for. And because the RGB looks so sick, you're gonna wanna have that sort of front and center. So that's what I would recommend. If you wanted to do another configuration, you could just put the fans on the other side of the radiator, but it depends on where you're mounting it. But again, the vast majority of people are going to put the radiator on the top of your system, and you're gonna want the fans sort of pulling air from the inside and exhausting it out the top. Now when it comes to installing fans, and this is actually the same thing if you're putting on an AIO, you're putting on an air cooler, or you're installing case fans, is first you need to understand the front versus the back of the fan. So almost always you will see like the main logo on the front. So you can see that this is the logo and you see the sort of the front of the fan blades. If I flip it over, you will see that there's the structure of the fan. So it's these little sort of like spindly guys, as well as all your like barcodes and that kind of stuff. That means that this is the back of the fan. So essentially the air is gonna come in the front and come out the back. Now, I will be honest with you, there's usually not like a super clear way of knowing short of just looking at it. Like it doesn't usually say like air comes out here or something, but you can see that these blades are clearly intaking it and exhausting it out the back. So that's the best way to tell you. I wish I had like a more foolproof way of doing that, but you need to think about this because airflow is important. Now, building a PC, it is filled with lots of very hot components. The main ones to think about are your CPU and your graphics card. Now your motherboard and some other things will put off some heat. You want general airflow in the case, but generally CPU and your graphics card by far the lion's share of the heat output in the system. And the whole point of all of these fans in your system is to exhaust that heat out, right? So most cases will have this sort of figured out for you already. So again, taking this Lian Li for example, if you look at it up front, we have two fans. These fans are pulling cool air from outside the case and bringing it inside. Now, with our AIO on the top, it is going to be pulling that hot air up, and this rear fan is doing the exact same thing. So it is pushing that hot air out the back of the system. This is definitely the standard way of doing it. Now, you can get a little creative. You know, people can do all push, all pull. I don't really recommend that normally, especially if this is your first time building your system, but you can certainly tweak and tune it. But what usually makes sense is your front fans pulling cool air in, your rear and or top fans exhausting hot air out. That's just the simplest way to think about it. All of that being said, when it comes to installing our AIO, it's relatively straightforward. You take the 4 screws and you tighten them down. While I'm here, I'm going to remove all of this plastic film that they have placed in many spots on this fan. That's a lot of plastic. Again, this was a really expensive cooler. It was totally overkill. This thing is fancy as hell. So at this point in the tutorial, we have installed or had our fans already pre-installed onto our AIO, and the next step is to install it on our actual CPU. This is where you're gonna pull out your manual because if you're doing AMD or Intel, it is going to be a different sort of setup. So now that we have consulted our handy dandy instruction manual, we're going to put our case on its back. Now you'll probably notice I have all these cables kind of dangling. They're fine. Maybe try not to pinch them too much, but don't worry about it that much. But you definitely want to have your case laying flat for this next step. So for our AM5 system, we're going to leave the back plate on the CPU, which is why we want to put the case flat down so that that plate doesn't come flying off. But we're going to remove these 4 screws that hold down the little brackets that come if you're using the stock cooler, for example. So it should be pretty straightforward. So that's the top bracket removed, which should just come off. So you'll see that we have these 2 little mounting points here. So this is what we're going to use for the actual cooler. So that's on the back plate, but once we take off these little brackets, that back plate can fall. So I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But for now, go ahead and remove the bottom screws as well. And obligatory mention that while I am following the instructions, and you should as well, this will be very different, especially if you're using an Intel CPU. That is going to be a completely different sort of setup. The actual like cooler and all that kind of stuff, like this all works the same, but as far as actually installing it on your motherboard, it is going to be different. And every brand likes to do a little different. Some use the back plate, some don't. Some use the mounting points. It's just different. And the thing is, if you actually look at one of these manuals, sorry, a little bit of a tangent. Oftentimes what they'll do, this one's not so bad, but this one will tell you like, oh, here's how to install it on like ancient systems too. So like I said, this one's a little bit more straightforward. It's not huge. It shows like 1700, LGA 1115, 11.5, so 1150, 1151, et cetera, shows AM4, AM5, but yeah, it's just, there's a lot of stuff to do. So now, with our brackets removed, it is time to actually get ready to install our CPU cooler. Before we install it, we're gonna have to take a look at our list of hardware and find the right screws, because you could install this on an Intel or AMD CPU. There are a whole lot more bits of hardware than you actually need. So now is a great time to reference what sizes of what we're looking for. So because we're using AM5, this is actually a pretty straightforward process. We just need to find these 4 little screws, and we're theoretically about ready to begin. Now, before I actually install these, I'm gonna come back over to our cooler. Now, as far as where you put the radiator, there's no like best spot for it right now. Just kind of tuck it off to the side, because we're gonna need to make sure we actually have it mounted. So again, referring to our instruction manual, it actually tells us the optimal way to mount the hoses for the best water flow or liquid flow. So we're gonna just kind of generally put this in place, put it at a little bit of an angle. Now, I'm not actually mounting it yet. All I'm doing is just kind of putting it roughly where it's gonna be. When you're installing things in a computer, it's usually a good idea to idiot check yourself on a regular basis. So I'm gonna put it roughly where it's gonna be. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. And then we're going to start rotating this around. So this specifically says I should put my tubes on the bottom for the best performance, which actually makes it fairly straightforward. So you can imagine what will happen is it will be mounted something like this. And then, yeah, that looks pretty accurate. Now that we have idiot checked ourselves to make sure that the cooler should fit, and it clearly fits in the top of the chassis, it is time to actually install it. For this system, I'm going to use their pre-applied thermal paste, which I'm sure is very high quality, but on the very likely opportunity that you do not have this already ready to go, I will show you how to install thermal paste on your system. So I'm gonna carefully put this off to the side, and I will show you what it looks like to put that on your CPU. There is a large amount of debate on the best way to install your thermal paste. So the old school method was just like a little grain of rice on the middle. I did that for many years, but newer CPUs tend to be a little bit larger, especially in this case of Intel chips. And you also can have a little bit more of like a hotspot kind of thing. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do my 4 corners plus the center. I don't have a fancier name. So with your tube of thermal paste, which will almost always come with your CPU cooler, it's not the world's best stuff, but honestly, it's totally fine. What we're gonna do is we're gonna put a little bit on the top left. And I'm taking a little bit, right? You don't go crazy with this stuff. Top right, bottom left, and then maybe a little bit more in the middle. You should use a little bit more than a little bit less. So this tube should do multiple applications. So you don't want to make this thing go goopy all over the place. Like some people will just absolutely unload it. If Mr. Yeaster's taught me anything, it's a little extra thermal paste never hurt anybody, but it is a pain to clean up when you want to replace your CPU cooler or something. And I will actually mention that, so obviously this is like our first time installation. Now, if this was say my second or third time, you want to replace that thermal paste every time. So 6 months from now, I want to take my cooler off to swap the CPU or whatever. You want to completely clean off both the actual block, or whether it's the CPU cooler for liquid or air, whatever the case is. You want to clean up all the thermal paste off of this guy and off of your CPU before you install a new one. But for these purposes, I'm actually going to wipe off what I just did, because again, we've got the thermal paste on here and there's no reason to not use it. So I'm going to go ahead and just actually remove that thermal paste, because the thermal paste that's already on there should be totally fine. There are different ways of doing this. I am a fan of the paper towel method. The only downside is it tends to leave a little bit of like paper towel stuff. So make sure to get it thorough. You also may want to use a little bit of rubbing alcohol. I'm actually not going to do that though, because I just applied this thermal paste. It should just come up pretty easy. So it's 1, 2, 3. And move my paper towel a little bit. 4 and 5. And I got almost all of it out, and now I'll use just a little bit of alcohol to remove it. So again, if this is your first time building a PC, you don't have to worry about this until you do it a little bit later, but just a little bit of alcohol should do the trick. Again, just if you're using a paper towel or something like that, just make sure you're not rubbing it too much, and it's gonna make a mess everywhere, but just a little bit of circular motion, and that is a clean CPU. So now let us install our CPU cooler. So the first step is to remove those brackets that are already there. For this Lee and Lee, we actually want to hold onto those screws because we're going to reuse them. And then we're going to take the brackets that it comes with, which have a little CPU on it. So it says CPU and the arrow just to show you which direction they're going to go on. So I'm going to take this and put it on the top. And then put another one on the bottom. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to reuse those 4 screws that came off of the brackets that originally came with it. And we're going to install those. And like always, we're going to do these about 2/3 tight or so, make sure it's fully seated, and then we will crank it all the way down. This is a thing you want to put a little bit of pressure on to make sure that it is firmly attached. I will say, this is, out of all the coolers you could use, one of the easiest I have ever seen. It's Very clean and easy to understand instructions. You've got yourself a lot of things that are already done for you, which makes sense because this is quite an expensive cooler. But you got the fancy unifans. Like, this thing is gonna look sick when we actually get it up and running. Never tighten anything down all the way the first try. Come back, go back and forth a time or two, and that is on there pretty firmly. Okay, now it is time to put our radiator roughly back in place so it's not gonna get in our way. That's the only downside when it comes to a 360 mil radiator. It looks really good. Like, it's gonna fill out all of the fan slots on the top, but it's big and it fits, but it's like not super easy to work with. Okay, so when it comes to actually installing this, it's very simple, but because I have thermal paste on here, normally you would have thermal paste on your CPU like I showed you, but because we have thermal paste here, once you apply it, you don't want to move it. If you wiggle around a little bit, that's fine. If you have to seat it and unseat it a time or two, the thermal paste is not gonna stick as well. So we're going to cleanly try to install this in one shot. So you'll see here that with this bracket, we have 4 little pegs. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and that is gonna correspond with these holes. So what we'll do is we'll line it up, again, because the instructions told us so. We wanna leave our tubes on the bottom. Gonna line up with our CPU. We're gonna firmly press it down into place. Now with one hand on it, we're gonna find our little screws, and we're gonna do these finger tight. So I'm gonna line up on the top left. Apologies if you can't see this too well, but I'm committed now, so I can't stop. So I'm just gonna get that finger tight. Don't worry about getting it like all the way on or anything, but just kind of get it started. Should be good. We'll grab one more of those, and like always, we're gonna use a cross pattern. So I'm gonna reach over to the bottom left, and I will tell you, if there is one area on this whole PC that you should listen to me when it comes to using a cross pattern, it is the CPU cooler. So what's happening, once you've got finger tight on two, you can let go. What's happening is that as you tighten down each of the corners, it is sort of pushing that thermal paste and your cooler down onto the CPU. This is really important. You want to make sure that that is making as good of a bit of contact as possible. Not only is it going to help to spread that thermal paste out, but importantly, it will make a very significant difference to the level of performance that you get. Like, if you say tighten one side down, the other side, it might be like completely like squished on one side, and you may be only touching like half of your CPU or something. So do one, then the other, then the other, then the other, but do it in that cross pattern. And honestly, go around a few times, right? So again, I like to start out by just doing it like finger tight. And that's fine to get everything sort of in place. So we're gonna do the top left here. You know what? We're actually running into an issue already, which is perfect, I can show you. So I'm gonna use one hand to steady the CPU cooler. So as you start to tighten it down, whatever side is not screwed in will start to pull up. So don't go like super, super hard. Like again, I'm just doing it half finger tight, just enough so this doesn't actually pop up and get out of my way. And then what I'll do is once I've got that, and I'll push this down just a little bit, I'm gonna go around with the screwdriver and tighten it, but I'm gonna do it in a pretty slow kind of manner. I'm gonna do a few turns on one side, a few turns on the next to make sure. This is actually one of the only steps of an AIO that's easier than an air cooler, because if you have an air cooler, the problem is that they tend to be really sharp. So you can see like on this one over here, it has all these like fins. That one's actually a nicer cooler because it's like rounded. Boy, the amount of times I have cut myself trying to like reach around like a CPU cooler and the fins are sharp as hell for no reason. Not fun, but with an AIO, that's much simpler. There we go. All right, I had to cheat a little bit with the screwdriver. So now I'm gonna do, make sure that's in there well. So once you got all 4 of these screws started, take your screwdriver and go all the way around. So again, corner, 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 and do it slowly. 2 or 3 turns of the screwdriver and then move to the next one. So I'm gonna start with this one. So go 1, 2, 3, then come up here, 1, 2, 3, and then come up over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That one's a little looser. 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. And again, you go around and around until the screws stop. So sometimes they'll have like a little spring on the bottom, but just get it until it's actually tight. Now, once you've gotten to this point, as long as you're patient, you should be fine. Also, I probably should mention this earlier, but just as a little heads up, sometimes CPU coolers, specifically AIOs, if they don't have thermal paste pre-applied, they'll have a little piece of plastic on them. Take that piece of plastic off. It has happened many, many times to many, many seasoned PC builders. Insert YouTuber of your choice here, including myself. This one didn't have it, so this one actually had this like hard piece of plastic on the bottom. But just make sure that when you're doing this, there's no like plastic or anything in between, because it'll technically work at really terrible speeds. Because guess what? You know what's not a good thermal conductor? Plastic. You'll actually want to go at this for a little while, because these screws have quite a long way, because they are really trying to make sure that it is very, very firm and very sort of evenly attached. So you're gonna end up screwing these for a while. Don't worry about it. As long as it's actually bit onto the screw, you'll be just fine. There we go. Alrighty. So with that, we have all 4 of our screws in place. You can give that a little wiggle and it is gonna be super solid, or at least it should. Feels wiggly and you've already screwed it all the way in. Time out, maybe take it off and make sure you actually mounted it correctly. I hate tutorials that say that, I'm sorry. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take our radiator, which I've already kind of put in place. If you got a larger radiator, it's a little bit harder to get, but also, well, it only goes in one way, so it's a little bit more straightforward. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna adjust it, and we wanna make sure we see all of our screw holes. So there are 3 120mm fans on this, so you should see 4 times 3. So we should see a total of 12. So what we'll do is we're gonna line up our radiator. So you'll see that it goes on these top series of holes. And make sure to adjust it so that all of the holes are visible. And same thing on the bottom. So you can see that with this case, technically I could put it like on one of these bottom rails, but that's only if we had a larger fan. So because these all line up on that top slot, it should be very straightforward. Now before we actually install it, you wanna make sure that you grab all the hardware. So with this one, we're gonna have a bunch of little washers and little screws. So what we'll do is we'll put the little screw through the washer. I think this is number, what do they call it? These are F's and G's. Little screws, little washers. The only thing I'll say is that when it comes to installing this, it does help if you have a magnetic screwdriver, because what we're gonna do is I'm gonna let the bit hold the screw and use my other hand to sort of guide the radiator in place. For this, all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put it in one corner, just gonna get it started, and then I will use my other hand to sort of straighten it out. It doesn't have to be perfect right out the gate. You just wanna make sure that there's a screw that's in there to keep it from just straight falling down. And just install it. Doesn't have to be super tight, but just so it's not gonna fall out. While I'm still holding it, I'm gonna do that one more time. So now I'm going to thread one more washer through the screw. Again, put it on the tip of my screwdriver. And then I'm going to line this up. So we're gonna move it up here, something like that. And again, this is a great time for us to slide it back and forth as needed, because once we put the second screw in, it's gonna be starting to get locked into its final position. So again, I'm not gonna do it super tight or anything, just make sure it's in place. And now is a great time to take a moment and count your screw holes. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go, everything is visible. At this point, now it's just time to rinse and repeat. Install all the screws with washers. Don't forget the washers, otherwise it might fall out. And that's pretty much it. And at this point, once you've got those first 2 in, you can actually start tightening things down. It should be in its final position. So I'll see you once I've screwed 10 more times. So when it comes to wiring up a CPU cooler, it ranges from simple to difficult. So if you're using a simple air cooler, it is usually a single connector or maybe 2 if you have 2 fans. So simple. When it comes to an AIO, I would refer you to this very helpful wiring diagram that is going to tell you what needs to go to where. So I'm not going to show you the details of this because again, it's going to vary based on every single CPU cooler out there. But what I will show you are some of the common things you will see and how to deal with them. If you're using an AIO, you're always going to have one of these PWM connectors. So it may be either 3-pin or 4-pin, it doesn't really matter. And what you'll see is that you have the little pins here, as well as 2 notches on the top, which denotes that it's only going to go in one way. This, if you're using an AIO, should be installed into the CPU optional. Now you could plug it into like a system fan header or whatever, but if you do that, you need to go into the motherboard and specifically tell it that it is a pump, because essentially this connector can be used for fans, in which case the fans can ramp up and ramp down. But when it comes to a pump that is going to constantly be circulating the liquid through your system, it should typically be set to a set standard speed. But regardless, if you have a CPU optional little connector, which is going to be right up here on the top right, and this one is actually even a different color so you can tell, it is as simple as just plugging it in. Beyond that, you're going to see that we have a whole bunch of cables dangling here, which I've started to put together. Now, this is our fan controller. So from this side, you'll see that we have both the power and the RGB from our Unifans. Now we have a couple of other things that are attached to it. So this one's pretty straightforward. This is SATA power. So you remember when we plugged in those SATA leads from our power supply earlier, because stuff like this often needs it? Well, here we go. This is what we're gonna need. Now on top of that, there's also a USB header. And in fact, actually with this system, we have 2. So this is a 9-pin USB. So this is the one that's on the bottom of the system. So this is USB 2.0. And I'm glad that we have 2 of them on this board because we need 2 of them for this system. So again, this is gonna have one little pin knocked out, so it's only gonna go in one way. And this comes not only from the actual controller, but because we have a fancy AIO with a screen, there's also a USB-C cable with a secondary USB 2.0. Now, this one's important because this is what's gonna tell your fans to go brrr or brrr. Yikes. This one is just purely for aesthetics. It's gonna allow you to play GIFs and whatever you wanna do on that little display. The last thing I'll show you here is our RGB. Okay, so there are two main types of RGB. So there is 5 volt and 12 volt. The simple way of thinking about it is like this. If it's got 3 pins and it says 5 volt, plug it into something that says 5 volt. If it has 4 pins and 12 volt, plug it into something on your motherboard that says 12 volt. Do not get these mixed up, because if you plug a 5 volt to a 12 volt, well, that's too many volts and it doesn't work anymore. So again, RGB is way outside the scope of this tutorial. It's very dependent on what manufacturer you use, etc., etc., etc. But most important thing is if you have RGB in your system, make sure that you're connecting it to either a 5 volt or a 12 volt and don't get them mixed up. It will clearly tell you, and again, this is 3 pins, so we know it's 5 volt, but just be careful. This will technically, one of the only components that actually you could shove this into a 12 volt. It would fit and it would cause bad things. And in fact, actually with this board, if you get real close up here, so with this motherboard, you'll see that we have a 12 volt LED connector with 4 pins here and a 3 pin for 5 volt here. So you can imagine how it'd be very easy to get those mixed up. So just be careful out there, friends. RGB is a dangerous world full of pitfalls and incompatibility issues and really, really terrible software. Next up, we're going to be installing a hard drive and or 2.5-inch SSD. If you were not doing this, feel free to skip this part of the tutorial. So I'm going to be installing this WD Blue hard drive, which again, is not what you should use to install Windows on. This is much more so for just extra storage for stuff you don't need like super quick access to. I will also at the same time show you briefly how to install a SATA SSD. So remember when we installed that M2 SSD underneath here? Yeah, like you should just do that. But if you're working with an older system, maybe you have an older SSD you want to install, whatever the case is, I will briefly show you how to do this. It's very similar to the hard drive, it's just a different sort of form factor. So before we do any of this, we're going to come around to the back of our case and we're going to pull out our 3.5-inch drive caddy. So most cases will have them down here. So you see that I can pull this out. This is where we're going to install the hard drive. Technically, if I was installing an SSD, I could also install it onto one of these guys, which I can take the thumb screw off and it will work the same kind of way. If you're just installing an SSD, I would actually recommend to do it in one of these because it's designed to sort of be nice and flat and flush and you just kind of hide it in the back. If you're not using a hard drive, you actually can easily just take this entire tray out and that's going to give you some more room for cable management and whatnot. Thankfully it's toolless, but I'm actually going to be using that. So I'm going to put that right back into place. We're going to be installing a hard drive into this 3.5-inch. So if you were installing your SATA SSD onto this guy, you'll see that there are 4 holes here and there are 4 holes on the bottom of the SSD. As you can imagine, you line it up and you screw it in with some of the screws that come with your case. But we are not going to be doing that. We're going to be installing a hard drive. So let's unbox this hard drive. This is really simple. In fact, actually with this case, like most things that Lee and Lee have done with this sort of setup, it's very, very straightforward. So we're gonna open up the hard drive. Now this actually does come with the screws to mount it in. Usually your case will also come with these same screws, but it doesn't really matter. So what we'll do is we're gonna take it out of the protective packaging. Now a little word of warning. So you know how earlier I mentioned that it's recommended to put your system together outside the case and do a little task before putting it in? Well, if I was gonna just give you like a number, a percentage of components that have problems out of the box, a hard drive is gonna be pretty high up on the list. So unlike basically every other component in your system, which has few to no moving pieces, this is a magnetic spinning platter of death. And you drop it, or it got dropped or tossed around at some point in its life, it may not function. So if when you post your system and everything lights up and it's all great and your hard drive doesn't show up, obviously double check this fully connected, but sometimes these things do just show up DOA. And I would say these tend to have problems much more than say an SSD, for example. So just a little word of warning. Not that you should be discouraged, you can always just like return it typically, but just a little heads up that hard drives are fragile and are made of magnetic bits. And so we have our hard drive. So this is very straightforward. There's really not a whole lot to it. So just be a little bit mindful that there is a circuit board on the bottom. It's not really going to be too fragile. This little ribbon cable is, but you know, just hold it by the side, it should be fine. So on the bottom of the hard drive, you're going to find 2 connectors. So one you should be very familiar with. It is our SATA power connector. So this is what we used to connect our fan headers is also something that comes directly off of the power supply. So that SATA power is what we used for our controller, for our fans, but typically it is used for hard drives. Beside that, you'll also see your SATA data connector. So this is also notched, although it is much less long than the SATA power. Now, your SATA cable should have come with your motherboard. So if you left all the stuff in that box, you might want to go and grab it now. So I'm going to pull it open. Now, typically you'll see two cables here, and they're slightly different based on how you want to do it. So unwind this. So on one side, you'll see that these are the same. So you'll see that it is a little clip on one side and there's a notch, so it only goes in one way. On the other side, you'll see that one of these is a flat data cable and one of these is a 90-degree. Which one you use is going to be entirely down to your system. So when I think about it, we could probably use either with this because we're gonna plug it in roughly here. I'm gonna use this flat one just because I think it'll be a little bit easier if a cable run. Yeah, I'll be able to plug something like that. But again, it doesn't really matter. Usually you have two just in case you have a really tight sort of bit of tolerance on your system or something. But that is all we actually really need to get this thing up and running. To install your hard drive into this tray, typically you'll need to use 4 screws and sometimes you'll have like little rubber grommets. But with this one, it's super simple because it already is toolless. So all you need to do is just bend it open a little bit and line up your hard drive. So when you do this, make sure to put the little barcode side facing forward because you want to have access to these ports on the back. But the way to do it is very simple. So we're going to open it up. We're going to try to slide it so it lines up somewhat like this. And then all you gotta do, you'll see that there's 4 holes, 1 on each corner of the hard drive. Just pull it open just a little bit so you have that clearance. 3, 4, boom, that's it. We're ready to install. Now, once you've done that, make sure that you have your SATA data and power facing towards you and not toward the front of the case where you can't reach it. We're gonna just take this and we're gonna line it up right here. Then we're just gonna take the hard drive and we're gonna click it right into place. Boom, look at that. That's a hard drive installed. All we gotta do now is grab our SATA data cable. We're gonna plug that in right here, making sure that the notch is facing downward. And we're also going to grab our lead from the power supply, which I probably should have prepped ahead of time instead of leaving it all dangled over here. So basically what I'm trying to do right now is I need to install the SATA up here. So technically I have enough SATA leads because I have one SATA that goes to the fan header that comes in the case, one that comes to this one, which is installed here, and the other one needs to go into the hard drive, but it is just too short to actually reach. I can kind of get it, but then, no, I just have to rewire the whole thing. Damn, all right. So I guess this is the point where I'm gonna go into my box of power supply cables and install 1 extra SATA just for 1 hard drive because it's ever so slightly too far away. So if you're like me and need a little extra power in your life, what we're gonna do is just plug this into our power supply, or maybe you just plug this in to begin with because you thought ahead and I was trying to be a little too optimistic. I'll plug this into our power supply exactly the same way we did earlier with our SATA power connected over here. I'm gonna run the lead out and run it into our power supply. So there you go. And now it is connected. Now you'll see that our cabling is getting a little bit out of control, although honestly it's not too bad. Now, it's tempting to start trying to like zip tie and clean things up. Don't do that yet. Make sure that everything is installed in the case, it's fired up, everything shows up first. Now a little bit of like, tucking the cable behind a little clip here or there, trying to sort of massage a run so it's not gonna be sticking out, that's fine. But just don't go too deep because there's a very decent likelihood that you may have to start tearing some stuff out, or you forgot something like you're 2 inches short of reaching your hard drive. Not that I forgot, I just didn't, I just was hoping I would be lucky. With that, the only other thing we have to do is plug in our hard drive to our motherboard. So what we'll do is we'll flip the case around. Oh, it's getting heavy now. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna route this cable over to this side. So this is a great opportunity to show you how to try to run things somewhat cleanly. So you'll see we have these little grommets. So even though we're not really worrying about cable management yet, always run cables to the closest sort of access point. So again, I can run it right here, and you'll see it's gonna pop out right beside our SATA leads. So what we can do is, if we flip this cable around, we can actually kind of plug that in so that it's sort of hidden. Obviously it's not completely hidden, but that's like a nice, flat, clean run. This doesn't matter hugely for anything besides aesthetics, but especially if you're building on a white case, your cables are gonna be very, very easy to see all the black cables, right? It's gonna be very, very contrasty. So it's a good idea just to try to run things somewhat cleanly when you have the opportunity to, because it will make it look a whole lot nicer once you get all the side panels on. But with that, we have ourselves a hard drive, or an SSD if you're using that, installed in the system. Now, the last thing I'll say on this, if for some reason you are installing an optical drive, so a DVD or a Blu-ray drive, it uses the exact same two connectors as your hard drive. So you'll have one SATA power, one SATA data, typically it'll go in the front of the case. I'll say I can't remember the last time I saw a brand new case that still had a 5¼ inch drive for optical drives. So, I mean, if you're keeping the physical media dream alive, by all means have fun, but yeah, that should be it. And now it's time to run some more cables. So our system is looking really good right now. The next step is going to be getting a lot of our cabling actually installed. Not cable management, but actually plugging stuff in. Now you could install the GPU right now, but I recommend holding out against that, mostly for the same reason as why we did this CPU power first. The GPU is big and kind of gets in the way, so it's much easier to do this without the GPU installed. So let's go from top to bottom, shall we? First up, we have our 20 plus 4-pin power connector. Now I like to start with this largely because it's a very thick cable. So we're not worrying about cable management right now, but what we are gonna worry about is being able to get our side panel on. So because this is so thick, what you do wanna avoid is a situation where you have to run two of these thick cables on top of each other. You just wouldn't have the room unless you really squash your side panel on. So what I like to do is I like to run this 20 plus 4-pin early, and then when you run the rest of your cables, you can kind of try to go around it as opposed to just crossing straight across it. So once you run this through, it is gonna have a clip on the bottom side, which is gonna only go in one way. So usually you're gonna have to do a little rotating action on this, but it's not too bad. And then we're gonna line it up, and then just gonna give it a nice firm bit of pressure on both sides in the middle until it clicks. And that's almost in there. There we go. And that's it. Now I will try to push that cable up a little bit so it looks kind of decent. It's a little dangly right now. The thing is, we actually have already done a bunch of the other stuff, right? So we already have our CPU power plugged in. If you did not do that, definitely do it now. We already have our SATA connected. So the next thing is to tuck some of our extra cables in, and we're gonna start installing some of our front panels, accessories, that kind of thing. So these are essentially all of the bits and bobs that come from your case. So starting out with, we have our big chunky USB 3.0 connector. So like I mentioned in the motherboard segment, this is for your front panel connectors on your case. And boy, oh boy, is it an easy connector to break. So when you plug it in, make sure you've got it run the correct way. You don't wanna wiggle around or whatever, because it sucks to remove. This is our USB-C connector for the USB-C on the front of the case. Not all cases have USB-C. Most of them do at this point, but that's what we're gonna use here. Then we also have our front panel connectors. Now, something that has gotten so much better compared to older school builds is how easy it is to do the front panel connectors. So there's a bunch of individual little connectors that are for things like your power button, the LEDs, your reset button, that kind of stuff. Now, most systems used to have this as a bunch of individual little connectors. So I'll show this from a previous video. This is what it used to look like. But with this Lee & Lee case, it all comes on a block, which makes it super simple. And on top of that, our Gigabyte motherboard has them all color-coded. So instead of having to dig through the manual and everything, you just look at the color code. But with this, it's even simpler because I just plug it in and it works, theoretically. Last but not least here, we also have our audio connector. Now this looks very similar to a USB 2.0. It is also 9-pin. However, it is gonna have a different pin knocked out. So the USB 2.0 has a pin knocked out on the top left. This one has the second from the left. So again, you can't accidentally do it, but very clearly says audio on here. And this is going to be running into our motherboard on the bottom left. So right here is where that gets plugged in. Now it's good to take a look at this before you start plugging things in, not only to make sure that you're running cables in a sort of neat way where you're not crossing them and making a giant mess, but also just because it's nice to know what you're looking for as you start diving into your motherboard, which is again why I like to show you what's going on in the motherboard section so that when I say, hey, look for a USB 3.0 header, you remember where that was, right? You remember where a USB 3.0 header is? You looked for it and you made a mental note of it before we moved on to this part of the tutorial, right? Good, I'm glad you were paying attention. All right, let's start running stuff. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna start with that audio connector. So again, I'm kind of breaking my own advice by running some of the cable management here, but it's gonna make our lives easier. So I'm just gonna try to tuck this underneath. We got our front panel audio coming out, so it's gonna always go to the far corner. So I'm gonna poke this through on the back side. And then I'll rotate the case around and you'll see that it is sticking out. So with our audio connector pulled through, again, there's a pin knocked out, so it's gonna only go in one way, which in this case, the labeling is gonna go upside down. We're gonna line it up with this connector on the bottom left, which is for audio. Insert it, and there we go. So that is going to get our headphone combo audio jack on the front to work. Okay, so next up, we're going to install our USB-C header, which is gonna go onto the motherboard, and it should just click right into place there, and we'll just tuck the excess off to the side. One thing, actually, I almost did it, and I'm gonna stop myself and explain it to you really quick. So as I push these cables in, and especially as you start to do like cable management on the back, what you'll see is while you can get a cable run nice and neat, you see if I start pulling this, you see how it starts kind of tugging that connector in? Don't do that. It's really easy to do. Try to make sure that when you actually plug these things in, that they're coming out at not too harsh of a bend. Not only because you don't want to break something off, but also sometimes you might actually like slightly tug the connector out when you're doing cable management. You do all your troubleshooting, you fire it up, and then like a week later you realize your front USB-C doesn't work. So just a little reminder to myself and to you, when you plug these things in, get rid of the slack, but don't pull it too much, because otherwise you'll see that bends way too far and starts to pull it out of the thing. So something like that should look nice and neat. Next, let's do our front panel connectors, shall we? If you are using a case and or motherboard that does not have everything nice, neat, and labeled, refer to your motherboard manual. It will tell you where to plug each thing in. So again, I'll show you some footage of previous years when I've done this. Essentially, every one of those little connectors are gonna have a little arrow on it. That is gonna denote the positive. So you'll see that like, oh, for your power connector, it'll say positive on one side, negative on the other. You would look for the arrow and you would put it in that orientation. Now, when it comes to doing these front panel connectors, it seems a little intimidating because it's a bunch of little fiddly wires, kind of hard to see. Here's the thing. You're not gonna do any damage. If you mess it up, it's totally fine. Worst thing that'll happen is that your power button won't work, and nothing will happen when you hit the power button, or your LEDs won't work or whatever. So if you have any problems when you do these front panel connectors, if you don't have them on this nice, neat little sort of breakout box, don't worry about it. A little bit of trial and error, you will be just fine. It's easy to panic when you press the power button and nothing happens, when you realize you accidentally plugged your power button into your reset switch or something. But if you're using this Lianli case, and some most recent cases, or at least a lot of them do have this, it's very simple because this plugs directly in. And again, this motherboard also works great because it's all nice and neatly color coded. But for this, what I'm gonna do is make sure that it is lined up. So we're gonna see that it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it goes in with the label facing forward, but again, refer to your manual if you have any questions about it. Plug that in like that, tuck the excess out into the back, and there we go. Theoretically, with that power button, things will work now. All right, last of the connectors for the motherboard is going to be that USB 3.0. Boo! Well, USB 3.0 is good, but boo, USB 3.0 connector. I sound like a freaking nerd. So for USB 3, this one's a little bit annoying to actually run because it's like sort of a double thick cable because it's got two little ends on it. So we're gonna poke it through right here. And again, I'm gonna try to get it roughly where I want it. The good thing about this connector is that even though it's got these two little cables on the end, it actually folds really nice and flat. So as long as you can get a good bend on the back side of your actual case, which I'm gonna try to do like this, you actually should be able to get it in nice and smoothly. So you'll see that on this, there's a notch. So there's a notch only on one side. That is gonna go with that corresponding notch on the board. So again, it only goes in one way. Please make sure that you've got this lined up as best as possible. Make sure that you don't need to unplug this for cable management or whatever. Try to tuck it in a nice, neat spot. Because again, don't take this connector out if you can avoid it. It will come out. If you need to take it out, try to do it very gently because this little sleeve, especially on, actually to be fair, this one's built a little bit better. That one looks a little bit stronger, but like that little thing can break off and it is such a pain. So just when you plug this cable in, try to make sure that you've got it nice and neat and where you want it. So I'm gonna line it up. Whoops, don't do that. I almost grabbed the pen. All right, so line it up and give it a nice little bit of pressure. It clicks into place. And that is all you gotta do, my friends. We now have our PC pretty much good to go. And in fact, if you were for some reason building a computer without a graphics card, we actually could get started from this point. Now, you should definitely install a graphics card if you were building a PC. But technically this would be a fully functional system. Now it is time for the fun part. Let's install ourselves a graphics card. So before we do this, we do just need to prep the case just a little bit. So the graphics card, like I mentioned earlier, is going to go into this top PCI slot. So the way to do it would be to take off some of these covers. Now, before you do that, I actually recommend to open up your graphics card. So most all graphics cards used to be dual slot. So the easy way to do it would be to look at your slot and go, oh, I'm gonna remove this one and this one right below it. But These days, graphics cards have gotten enormous, especially if you haven't built a PC in a while. They've gotten long, they've gotten tall, they've gotten wide, like they've just gotten huge. So what I'd like to do, you can look up the spec, but honestly, I just like to actually take the graphics card out of the box, line it up, and just visually see like, oh, it's clearly a triple slot card and blah, blah, blah. It just sort of helps to visualize before you start taking off these little panel covers, these PCI covers, and then realize that you grabbed the wrong one because the graphics card was bigger than you thought. Now this actually should be a fairly reasonable size GPU, especially when you get some of like the overclocked cards that have like these massive beast feed coolers. I mean, they're great, they have a lot of performance, but they just take up so much space. Which is also why cases like this have a little bit of extra width involved. So you can see right here, a lot of cases used to kind of cut off right about here, but you have all this extra space not only for cooling, but just to fit some really big cards. Like you should be able to fit any graphics card ever, essentially in this case right here. And that's becoming more and more common. But if you are maybe like reusing an older case from a previous build, this would be a great time to double check that your graphics card actually fits. It should fit, but some of these things get huge, man. They really do. Packing steps and unpacking steps, really? You need to tell me how to do this? Wow. And that's it. Wow, look at that. That's some, you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of when you buy like an Apple product, like an iPhone or something. When they ship it to you, they do it in this like little like plastic sort of like container-y thing. All right, I'm gonna get rid of all this. The only other thing in the box, and we're not gonna be using it, but I will highlight it nonetheless, is a little adapter for your graphics card. So, if you remember earlier when I was talking about when we were choosing our power supply, and I mentioned if you're using a newer RTX 40 series card, that it uses a different kind of power connector. So if you look on top here, this is our 12-pin power connector. So if you've not built a PC recently, this is probably gonna be a new looking connector. Now again, that is a single cable that will deliver up to 600 watts, plenty for this graphics card and then some. However, if you are using an older power supply that does not have that connector, every one of these graphics cards should come with one of these. So on one end, it's a 12-pin 600-watt adapter. On the other end is a pair of 8-pin PCI connectors. This will work. It is included in the box for a reason. They have been a little bit unreliable. If you are using this, you can feel free. Fully connect every part of it. Make sure that the 8 pins are clicked in there. Make sure that this goes fully seated into the graphics card. Because this is very, very thin gauge wiring that's just pumping a ton of voltage through it, they do have a tendency to fail. So I would just say, I would normally recommend if you're using a RTX 40 series card to go with a newer power supply that has that 12-pin built on. This will work. It will come with every 40 series card as far as I know, unless they change that in the future. It's fine. And again, if you're using an older NVIDIA card, a 30 series or earlier, if you're using an AMD card, if you're using an Intel card, this is not relevant. You're just gonna have like an 8-pin or a couple of 8 pins on there, but just as a heads up, this will be in the box and it's fine, but not really recommended. So there is a lot of plastic on this card. Look at that. Wow, they really wanna keep you protected. Take off all the film, which I will say you should 100% do, because this film, even though it won't keep it from working, is super ugly. And if you leave the film on for a little while, it can melt on. I've seen people who never took this off and it freaking gets all like yellowed and gross. Just take off the film. All right, last things we need to do is there's going to be a little protector over our PCI slot. So you want to take that off the back. That is what's actually going to connect to the motherboard. And then on the back side of the card, there's a bunch of little port connectors for our display ports and our HDMI. Wow, that's really in there. And there's also, of course, more plastic on the back. All right, that should be everything we need to get our graphics card up and running. So before we install it, let me walk you around it really quickly. So obviously we have a couple of fans. All graphics cards are different. Some have 2 fans, some have 3 fans. Not super relevant. What I will point out is the actual backside of the card. So this is the actual part that sticks out the back of the chassis. So you'll see that you have your display ports, you have your HDMI. Now you'll see that this actually sticks up over the PCI slot, right? So older graphics cards used to cut off at this point. A lot of newer ones have kind of expanded out here, which as I kind of show you here, that's where some of this extra space comes in handy. That doesn't stick out enough that it will be a problem for most cases, but just something to keep in mind, especially if you're building like in a small form factor system. Make sure that the dimensions of your card are compatible with the case, because it can be a very tight fit. Even if it technically works and you have like no clearance, it can be sometimes kind of hard to like kind of wedge it in there. Because basically what we need to do is line it up here and go straight back. Now, thankfully, this is almost a true dual slot card. So what I mean by that is that you'll see that we have the 2 slots. It goes over just a little bit. So you see here that's a little bit extra on this side. It's pretty close to a dual slot. I'll tell you, honestly, this is actually a fairly decent sized GPU. So again, this is a 4070 Super. You can definitely find graphics cards that are way chunkier on the cooler. I think this is actually a pretty nice blend. Now, the last thing I'll show you here, and it's only going to be on some cards, is there's a little switch here. So there is a P and a Q. It means mind your P's and Q's. Nah, it's performance and quiet. I'm gonna leave it on performance mode. This is not super important, honestly, and sometimes you can even change that in the actual driver settings sometimes. No, sorry, not driver settings, the ASUS software or whatever. This basically will just change the actual performance profile of the GPU. I never play with it. I just always put in performance. And what are you gonna buy a 4070 Super and then say, hey, I want quiet mode? It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. All right. Let's install this thing. So to install, what we'll do is before we actually do it, we'll line it up. So we again want to make sure that we know what actual covers we need to remove. So we'll line it up with this slot, and you'll see that we need to remove cover number 2, cover number 3. Very standard. If you have a bigger card, sometimes you actually have to remove 3 covers. But for this, we're going to just install it in the top 2 slots. I will say some cases have a vertical graphics mount. So what that would be is you would actually install the graphics card like right here up front, and they would have like a little riser that plugs into your motherboard. It's a little bit specialty. It certainly is a thing, and you actually can buy, like a lot of cases will actually have like an adapter plate that you could do that yourself. It certainly looks cool, I'll totally admit. It looks cool to have your graphics card like that, but this is by far the most standard kind of configuration. So what we'll do is we're gonna remove slot number 2. And keep these slot covers handy when you take them off, because if you ever need to replace it or whatever, it's just nice to have. And also keep the screws, because we're gonna reuse those in just 1 second. So see, that's 1 cover. I'll also mention, it's really not that common, but if you're building in a older or very cheap system, sometimes they actually don't unscrew. Sometimes you actually have to like physically bend these little slot covers out, which feels really gross. Just as a heads up, in case you, again, have like a very budget-oriented case, pretty much anything above like that $50 price point these days is gonna be unscrewed. But just in case yours is one of those bender things, you just take it and you bend it back and forth until it snaps out. Doesn't feel good, but that's the way they're designed. So you gotta save some money somehow. Okay, my friends, we've got ourselves our covers out. The installation of the graphics card is incredibly simple. So we have our PCI connector right here. It is going to go into the motherboard. Again, you want to go into the top PCI slot. So technically it would fit and work on the bottom ones, but you're going to be severely limited in bandwidth. Also, why would you do that? There's no reason. Okay, so we're going to line it up. So make sure that it is lined up here. And all you got to do is making sure that it's all securely set up. We're going to firmly push it into place, and you'll hear it click. Ready, and boom. There we go. Now, if this was a heavier graphics card, I wouldn't have taken my hand off so fast, but I'll tell you, some of the really heavy graphics cards are, they're really heavy, and they'll actually kind of sag. Again, this is a plastic, primarily plastic shroud GPU. It's not super heavy, so that actually sits in there fine. Some, if you're rocking like a really big, heavy, like 4090 or something, oftentimes you'll actually want to use like a little riser. So sometimes they actually come where they just kind of give a little support on the back side of the GPU, or sometimes they'll actually take up one of your slot covers and give a little bit of extra lift. It sounds a little bit silly, but when you get a really heavy graphics card in place, it can slowly sag. Not only it looks sort of bad, but it actually can pull itself out of the slot, especially if you're ever like shipping or moving your PC. It's not really a PC tutorial thing. This is just a ownership of a gaming PC kind of tip. Be careful with the graphics card if you ever move or ship your computer. Now, we're gonna screw it into place. That should be fine for this, but if you're ever actually doing like some real moving of your PC more than just like gently like picking it up and bringing it to like your car or something, I actually pretty much always take the graphics card out. Again, they've gotten really heavy, and while they're fine stationary, if you're moving this thing around, it can either snap off or fall or bend or whatever. Just, if you're doing anything more than just a gentle move of your PC from place to place, I usually take the graphics card out. It's also really simple because it's a couple of screws and 1 or 2 power cables, but just a little pro tip. So we're gonna take those same screws that we took out of the covers, and we're going to load up our graphics card and give it a little bit of extra support. So now that the graphics card is installed, you should see why we did so much before this point. Because, if I'm trying to install our USB-C or USB 3.0 or a lot of these things, it's much more difficult to do with the graphics card in the way. It's definitely nice to get as much of this done as possible and then install your graphics card. We're almost there, my friends. We're very, very close. Last thing we need to do for the graphics card is run our power. So, yet again, I'll be very clear just in case you skipped through the video and weren't paying attention. We have ourselves our 12-pin power connector, which is very thankfully yellow, so you don't accidentally forget to plug it in. I don't know. We're gonna plug this in. It is the exact same way if you were using another kind of GPU. You would be plugging in your 6, your 6+2, your 8, however many power connectors it actually needs. You would plug it in the same way you would connect it, like say the CPU power or something. There's a little notch on it, so it only goes in one way. But we're going to install this like so. Now, before I actually do it, I will say there's a couple ways we could run this cable. None of them are that clean, so I think I'm just gonna run it along the side. I could run it from the top or the bottom. The thing is, if you get on the bottom, it actually kind of gets close to the fans, and I don't like that. And it looks kind of ugly. I think we could kind of do it on the top, but honestly, there's not like a really good way of doing it. I'm just gonna do it on the side, and we'll just kind of get rid of the slack as much as possible. It's not the most pretty thing in the world, and you do want to be careful when you plug that in to make sure that it's fully seated. A little less important when it is the actual power supply versus the adapter. If this is the adapter, I'm like making sure it's in there super tight. That is definitely in there, but you don't want to like tug, or especially if you have like a case that has like a very sort of small tolerance. Like if anything's like pushing against that, like the side panel, not good. Thankfully, we have plenty of space, so it's fine. So a little bend is okay, but nothing that's too aggressive. Make sure that it just feels like it's got a little bit of leeway. That, my friends, is actually a completed PC.
Yay!
I know, right? Where did the time go? So there's a few things we're gonna wanna do before we're actually done, so stay tuned, we're not done yet. But before we go through and tidy things up and button up the case and everything, we're going to do a quick little power test. Now, theoretically, you may have done this power test earlier with all of your components all over the case or all over the table or whatever. That's fine. Regardless, you need to do it again with everything installed here. You wanna make sure everything works, everything shows up. So time to grab your keyboard, your mouse, your monitor, power cable, and get everything plugged in so we can do one final boot test. So with everything plugged in, let me just run you through a couple of steps before you hit that big red or white or blue power button. So there's a few smaller things we should do. First and foremost, you see this little switch on the back of your power supply? See the 0 and the 1? Flip it to 1. I can tell you the amount of times I built a PC and forgot to do that and it doesn't do anything because your power supply's off. While you're back here, you also may want to press the little 0 fan button that's on most moderate to high-end power supplies. That is just going to allow the power supply fan to only turn on when it needs to versus always be spinning. On top of that, you see how I've got my DisplayPort cable plugged into my graphics card? So technically, I could plug it into my motherboard, and that would work. The problem though is that I would be using the very wimpy integrated graphics on our CPU. Now that's fine for troubleshooting, or if you're maybe building the PC and you're getting your graphics card next week or whatever. But if you have a graphics card, you should always plug it in to your graphics card, right? Don't use this if you have this. That makes sense? Get a graphics card, plug your monitor into that one. Okay? Good? The amount of people who have like a badass graphics card, you plug in the HDMI whatever to your motherboard and go, man, this gaming sucks because you're not using the graphics card. Also, while I'm back here, because our motherboard does have Wi-Fi, I'm just gonna pre-install our modules or our little antennas. You don't have to do this for the BIOS. I just like to do it while I'm back here so I don't forget. Because technically, much like a lot of things on a computer, you can actually make it work in a somewhat jank way if you don't have the antennas. You actually will get some Wi-Fi reception, but obviously the antennas help that tremendously. All right, so we're gonna 1 and 2. Cool. I think that's pretty much everything we need to do on the back of the system. Now, the only other thing I will mention is that obviously we're doing this test with the computer, fully assembled and whatnot. Now, because this is our first test boot of the system, we're of course just gonna be pressing the power button and hoping that it works. If, however, you have built your system outside the case for a test, you actually can use a screwdriver to turn it on. That sounds sketchy, but it's fine. all you need to do is go on your front panel connectors, and there are the 2 pins for power. You take a screwdriver or any piece of metal really, and you bridge those 2 pins, and it essentially will turn on the system. So just a little heads up. It's really helpful for troubleshooting as well, knowing that you can just easily jump the board. It's not sketchy, don't worry. Don't maybe stick your screwdriver on all the pins and all the metal bits. You probably find something that's not good, but when it comes to those front panel connectors, you just have to tap it. But that's it. That's everything we need to do. We've got our monitor plugged in, our HDMI or display port connected, a mouse and keyboard ready to go. Everything's turned on, fired up. All we gotta do now is press the power button and hope that we have made a good decision with our lives. Okay, so we've got, I forgot to plug in the fans from the case, so I'll do that after we're done here. But importantly, we have all 3 of our unit fans running for the CPU cooler. Your graphics card fans actually don't always turn on. So if it's a more modern GPU, oftentimes they don't spin up until the GPU gets a little hot. We've got our screen on our Land League cooler that's activated. And if I come around here, hey, you got a new CPU installed. Congratulations. That is a very good sign. We're gonna hit Y. We're gonna let the motherboard do its thing. And assuming that everything shows up here in the BIOS, we have successfully built ourselves a PC. So I will need to plug in our fan header, which I forgot to do. In fact, here, don't do this, but I'm just gonna plug it in because I left it connected right here. So now you can see that we got all of our fans running in the system. Now at this point, the fan is cranking at 100%. There's some things that we're gonna need to tweak. None of that matters right now. There's plenty of time to do that. All we need to do is in our BIOS, hit OK here, and we wanna make sure that everything shows up. So, we go through the list. We see the motherboard, Ryzen 7 7700X, perfect. We see our SATA hard drive. We see our PCI card, which is the PCIe X16, perfect. And we see our Samsung 990 Pro. So that means our SSD, our hard drive, and our graphics card are all showing up fine. On top of that, we see our RAM. So we see 1 G.Skill 16 and 2 G.Skill 16s. That is everything we need to look for right now. There's a bunch more stuff we need to actually do with the BIOS, installing Windows. I'm gonna walk you through that entire process. But this is a perfect opportunity to take a big old deep breath and say, congratulations, me, I built a PC. I mean, not me, like, I'm congratulating you for building a PC. Yeah, we did it! Woo!
You're the best.
That ever was. To catch them is my real test. To train them is my cause. Da, da, da. So a lot of what we're doing today is software. So we're going to be updating the BIOS, installing Windows, drivers, that kind of stuff. But before we do that, we're going to do just a little bit of cable management. And I'm going to do the one thing that I did not do yesterday, which is plug in our fan header and our actual RGB hub. So if I rotate the system around, it's mounted here. This is not in all cases. I would say a lot of cases these days will have some kind of fan hub. So the problem with these is that you gotta do a little bit of searching. So for these, I've gotta fish my cables out from this cable management here. So technically they're run down, but I actually want to plug them into the top of the board. So what you'll see here is that this case has these nice little cable channels, which is lovely, except for when you need to pull something out and you have to undo the twist ties. Now, I'm not gonna go super in depth on this part because it's gonna be highly dependent on the case and the cable management and whatnot that you've got. What I will do is I will show you pulling my fan headers out. So right now they actually will work. So you saw earlier they actually fired up when I gave them power. But the problem is that by default they're just gonna be running at 100% speed, which is not ideal. I'm gonna pull these cables out, which come out from here, so that's fine. So we're gonna just pull the excess out of here. And then what I'll do is I'm gonna tuck the cables that we don't need anymore behind these little clips. Then you can go incredibly in-depth on cable management. For me, as long as things are sort of tidy and I can easily get at stuff and trace runs, I don't care too much. The main thing you have to do is just make sure that your cables will be able to close behind the side panel. So I can immediately tell that while a lot of this stuff is actually not too far off, like my 20+4 pin, my CPU, my GPU actual cable, some of these are gonna be a little bit thick. So what I'll do is in a minute, I'll come back through and actually run them all. But before I do any of that, let me plug in our last cables, which is going to be for our RGB and for our fan controller. So you saw that when I plugged it into power, the actual hub, all my fans on the case started spinning. That's totally fine, but they were spinning at 100% because they have no communication with the system. They just have power, they're cranking. So by plugging these into the motherboard, not only can we control the RGB on these fans, but importantly, we can also have the motherboard automatically spin them up and down based on the load of the system. No reason to have fans cranking 100% almost ever. So rotate this around here. I'm gonna plug these in. These are the exact same connectors that we already showed. So it is our 3-pin 5-volt RGB header, as well as our 4-pin PWM for the fans. So I'm gonna plug that into our system fan slot up on the top left, or top right rather. And same thing for RGB. And I'll plug this in right here. It's the same stuff as we were doing before, just one additional set of cables. And then, like always, I'm gonna pull that excess out, run it along the top, and then what I'll do is I'm just going to tuck it into this little plastic cable holder. Now, you see there's a lot of cables behind this one, but that's fine. Honestly, like these are really easy to work with. So when it comes to doing cable management, I'm not gonna give you a super in-depth tutorial. Again, kind of try to clean things up as much as you can. It helps a lot if you ran cables smartly the first time. So a few things that I will do is tuck the obvious stuff. Like this thing can just kind of tuck back here a little bit more. These are actually kind of fine as is. Now, you can go super in depth on this if you'd like. I like using these little clips because they really kind of help hold things in place. The other thing you should do is if you have something like Velcro. So you can see that I have Velcro ties all over the place. These essentially work as cable channels. For this one, I realized, oh, I should run that inside the Velcro and it'll help kind of tuck it in a little bit. So in fact, I actually should sort of push both of these in, and right off the bat, I bet you if I put that side panel on, it will just go. We've all done the whole struggle to shove the side panel on. There's no shame in that. But yeah, that will clearly work. I'm gonna clean these cables up a little bit, throw the side panel on, and then it is time to start updating our BIOS. And just like that, we've got ourselves a side panel on. Now, I will just take a second and show you just putting the rest of the case together before we install our BIOS. The rest of this is very straightforward. So we're gonna take our little cover for our basement and line this up like this. And there we go. So this will help to hide our power supply and all of our extra cables that we definitely very carefully cable managed, and it's super tidy, but you know, it's like your basement in your real house. You want to hide it from view so that people don't judge you for hoarding, or I don't know, whatever you put in your basement. I'm not judging. And then we're going to put our top panel on here, which again, this should just slide right on. Most cases will break down to this level. Not all cases will let you take off the cover for the basement, but most will. And I'm just gonna line it up here, make sure it's fully seated. And the good thing about this case is it's all thumb screws, so you actually don't need to pull out the screwdriver if you don't want to. Like I can thumb screw all this together. It also makes it really easy if you need to open up the case and double check something or whatever. Before you put everything back together, sometimes it's worth just giving it a quick power cycle just to make sure that everything is still working once you do a cable management. Every once in a while, if you're like pulling a cable, it might pull something loose or whatever. So, you know, it's probably a good idea, but honestly, as soon as you put the side panels on, you really shouldn't have to take them off until you're ready to upgrade or do something else. I'll be honest, I don't always pay a ton of attention to the color scheme of my build. I try, but a lot of times I get like blindsided or very excited about some deal at Micro Center, and I will like forget that it's a brown graphics card for my red case or whatever, but like this one looks pretty good. And what you'll find is when you're picking components, usually white and black are like sort of the standard colors, because we also have to consider that we have RGB to work with. So you have some element of customization even after you've built it. That certainly helps when you have something that looks clean right out of the box. All right, so I'm gonna line this up. It's gonna pop in place. And then again, there's one thumb screw in the back. And that is a physically assembled computer. Good job, my friends. Before we proceed, I definitely recommend to update your BIOS. So to do this, you're going to need a USB flash drive and typically a Windows computer, although you can sometimes do it on a Mac. You just have to make sure that this is formatted correctly. Typically it's FAT32, but I'll show you that in just a second. So the point of updating your BIOS. So the BIOS is essentially the software that runs your motherboard. So this runs before Windows, and it's important for a lot of reasons. Not only does it have like security implications sometimes, performance, stability, it's a pretty important thing. Now, you can update this later, and it's not a bad idea to update your BIOS every once in a while. But when you first got your PC built, it is always a good idea to either update it or make sure that you are running the most up-to-date BIOS. So I already checked earlier in it, and I know that there's a newer BIOS online because this is only F1, which is like the first launch model. Now to find out, what you'll do is you'll just Google the name of your motherboard. This is a Gigabyte B650 Gaming X AX V2. An easy name to remember. So I'm gonna hop on to the Gigabyte website. Same thing if you're using ASUS or MSI or anything like that. You're gonna wanna look for support. And so for BIOS, we can see that F1, which is what we're running, came out in December of 2023, but there is a F3 BIOS that came out in January. So you can see there's a couple of little updates. Doesn't matter, we want to download that. When it comes to installing BIOSes, it's sometimes a little different based on the vendor, but typically you'll want to extract it and copy it over to a flash drive. You can use any size flash drive really. What I'm gonna do is, just for safety, I'm going to reformat this one. I'm going to format this drive as NTFS. Let me just label it BIOS and hit start. Yes, I do want to format. And then once that is formatted, it will pop up for me. And then what we'll do is we'll close this out. And then all I need to do is copy the entire contents of this. It really needs that F3 file, but I'm gonna copy the entire contents over to my BIOS USB. So we'll give it a second, and that's it. So we take this USB out and we plug it into our system. You can plug it into any USB. I like to plug it into one of the ones on the actual motherboard just because it feels a little bit safer. In fact, actually, I will definitely do that because on this board, it has a specific port that looks for the BIOS. This is more meant for like troubleshooting and stuff, but whatever. I'm just gonna plug it into my BIOS USB. As I hit my power button, I'm going to spam the delete key on my keyboard, which will get us into BIOS. So spam, spam, spam. You just want to spam it until you actually get into the BIOS. This is a little bit more relevant when you already have Windows installed, because traditionally when you hit the power button on your computer, give it a second and it will launch into Windows. But you saw that gigabyte screen that showed up there. We want to make sure that we've clicked it by that point, but it's fine. So what we're going to do is, before we adjust any of our settings, we want to make sure that our BIOS is up to date. So what we need to do is go to QFlash. Every vendor does it a little different. So some call it like Easy Flash, some call it QFlash. Look around your settings or Google it really quick to find exactly what it's called. It's essentially the BIOS update tool. So here, it's QFlash, it's right here. All right, I would like to update my BIOS. Yes, I would love to. On the left here, it tells me what BIOS I'm currently running, which is F1 from December of 2023. But in this case, I already had checked beforehand and I know that I need F3, which is a more recent version from January. So I'm gonna click on that. Hit the arrow button. It's gonna ask me if I want to do it. I say yes. Now, as I do this, it's gonna take a few minutes, right? So it's gonna verify. Now, while we update the BIOS, don't touch your computer. It's gonna do some stuff. It's fine, let it do its thing, because we are updating the BIOS, and while a lot of boards will be fine, if there's something goes wrong, it'll fall back, it'll check everything. You don't really wanna rely on that. And if something does go wrong during this process, it could cause some damage to your system. Typically, it just requires you to reflash the BIOS yourself, but it's a whole thing. So while we're updating BIOS, hands off everything related to the computer. Don't let your dog near the power cable to kick it down or whatever the case is. So see, it's restarted, is now verifying the file is correct, and it should, after 5-10 minutes or so, have a brand new BIOS installed on our system. So there it goes. We're going from F1, it's confirmed everything. It is now updating from F1 to F3. So again, hands off. Keep a few feet away from your system. Don't breathe too hard. That's fine. Just don't touch it. Don't mess it up. And then once we've updated the BIOS, that's when we actually can go in and start tweaking some settings. But typically when you update the BIOS, it nukes all the settings that you put in the BIOS. So, if you start to like change your RAM speed and dial in overclocks or any of those things, typically, not always, but typically when you update the BIOS, all that gets rewiped anyway. So I just like to do this at the very beginning, and then we can go in and tweak a couple of settings and whatnot. All right, no, I didn't hit the button fast enough. Okay, so here's a little tip. We should make sure, we're gonna hit the reset button real quick. We should make sure to spam that delete key. Most of the time it lands in BIOS, sometimes it doesn't. Spam the delete key, please. There we go. All right, cool. So now we can see that everything worked because in our BIOS information, it now says we are on F3. So we are on the most up-to-date version of the BIOS. Now there's a few things we want to do. So again, a good time to just double check everything's still showing up correctly. So Ryzen 7, we've got ourselves CPU temperature, which is 28 degrees, which is very much within spec. If you were having issues, like so say you didn't put your thermal paste on, maybe you left the little plastic thing on, your fans are spinning, what you would see is even in BIOS, this CPU temperature would start to climb very quickly. So you should see it be generally below like 40 degrees Celsius would be a good sort of general rule of thumb. And especially with a nice AIO like this, 28 degrees Celsius is barely above room temperature. It's very, very cool. All right, so now let's go ahead and start setting up a couple of things. So this motherboard actually has resizable bar support right here and is already enabled. This is, if it's an option, you should always do that. most modern graphics cards with resizable bar, it essentially allows them to bypass a little bit of the overhead and sort of just give you a little bit of extra performance. I can't think of any reason why you would not want to turn that on if it is an option if your graphics card supports it. So thankfully this board already has it. Now we also have our DDR5 auto booster. So I click on that and then hit enable. And then I also hit on the XMP/EXPO profile. What it's going to do is automatically not overclock our RAM, but set the RAM to the speed that it is designed to run at. So XMP is the Intel version, EXPO is the AMD version. They're functionally the same. And in fact, some AMD systems will work with XMP and whatnot. Doesn't really matter. Essentially, this RAM, while default, it's running at 4,800 mega transfers. I think this RAM runs at 6,000? Yeah, this runs at 6,000. So basically, that RAM can run faster, which is going to give you more bandwidth. Not only going to help speed up your CPU, it's just a one-click thing to give you a whole lot more performance. Now, there's other stuff we can do in here. I am not going to be doing that for the purposes of this tutorial. Now, if you want, you can go into like their fan curves. You can actually adjust all the different fans in here. So if we want, we can go out of easy mode and into advanced mode. This is outside the scope of this video, but if you're going to be doing things like overclocking, or especially if you want to do like troubleshooting, so sometimes you need to like fiddle with some random bits and bobs. Again, I'm not going to show this for this video. I'm just going to hit save and exit. I'm going to save, and I'm going to save the configuration. So we're gonna do that. We're gonna let it reboot. I am going to spam the delete key to get into the BIOS one more time. I just wanna make sure that the XMP profile, or the EXPO profile in this case, took, and that everything is booted correctly. A good time to mention that if you run into problems at this step, typically memory, if you're clocking it too high or you have like a really fancy kit and the CPU can't hold up or whatever, you could have some stability issues. So that's why I like to hop into the BIOS once it wants to boot and ensure that we have actually hit the correct speed, which 9 times out of 10 it'll run fine right out of the gate. But we want to just go back over to easy mode. So you can see here now that our memory frequency went from 4,800 to 6,000, which is exactly what should be working with our G.Skill modules. Cool, all right, so we're actually done with the computer for a moment. It is now time to install Windows. When it comes to installing Windows, there are a few options you have. First and foremost, you need to make your decision between Windows 10 and 11. I would recommend 11, mostly because Windows 10 is actually getting a little bit like, I think they've only got like another year or something of support. Like Windows 11, I know some people aren't like a huge fan of it, but like at this point, it's kind of tough to justify using Windows 10 when it might not be supported for that much longer. Now, how you get Windows 11, there's a bunch of different ways. So if you already have a code for some reason, you could actually just download a Windows tool, which is available from Microsoft, and essentially that will allow you to load up a copy of Windows on a flash drive, and then you can use your own actual code for it. I, of course, have purchased a full copy of Windows 11 from Micro Center, which I will be using, and the one that I've got here comes with a flash drive. So all you do is plug this flash drive in and put the code that comes in the back of the box, and that'll be good to go. So do with that information as you will. So here is our key. So if I flip around to the back, you would see, I'll cover it up, you see here's our key, which has our friggin' 25-digit or whatever code on it. We're gonna keep this handy. We're gonna need that a little bit. And then we have our handy Windows flash drive. You could actually make your own Windows flash drive. It will be definitely a more up-to-date version than whatever was shipping on this drive. As far as I'm concerned, if it comes in the box, we'll plug it in. It'll just take a little bit of extra time to update. It's outside the scope to like friggin' make your own flash drive. You don't need to do that. If you do need to make a flash drive, it is very simple. There's a tool, I think it's the Windows Media Creation tool. You download it directly from Microsoft. You plug your USB in, it downloads Windows, it puts it on the drive, it's super easy. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to actually, I probably should have done that beforehand. I'm gonna restart the system. So we're gonna go save and exit. And one more time, we're gonna spam that delete key. And with our USB install, we want to make sure that we're booting from this. So get used to that, spamming the delete key to get into the BIOS, because we're gonna be doing it a whole bunch today. Cool, all right. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're booting from our USB. So right here, you can see that I've got Windows 10 here, so I can just hit F10 and exit. You also could manually just select like USB or whatever, but theoretically, we don't have to spam delete this time. It is going to restart the system and start booting off of this USB. Now if that works, we will start to see Windowsy bits pop up in one moment. There we go, loading files. So it is gonna start loading up a copy of Windows 11. So you'll see, as soon as you see that little pinwheel, you know Windows is activating. And that is really fast. There we go, Windows setup. I'm gonna walk you through this really quickly. There's not a whole lot you need to worry about, so we'll just get past the language screen. There's only one thing I really wanna highlight, which is to install it on the correct drive, especially if you have multiple hard drives or SSDs inside. Oh look, activating my Windows key. I'm gonna do that later, but I've got one, and I can install it whenever I want. You should do that though, if you've got your key, because Windows will work without the key for a little bit, but it gets grumpy. You can't like change like your wallpaper and a bunch of other stuff. Again, we're gonna do that soon. All right, so installing the operating system. So you'll see that we have a ton of options here. We're gonna want to install the option that we've purchased, which in this case is Windows 11 Home. So we're gonna select Home. We're gonna agree to the terms and conditions. Now, we're going to hit Custom Install, okay? Now you'll see that we have two drives showing up. So we have drive 0, which shows us 3.7 terabytes, and we have drive 1, which shows us 2 terabytes. So you need to know what drives are in your system, because Windows won't tell you what's what. And we could technically install it on the bigger drive, but that is a very slow hard drive. Don't do that. Install it on your SSD. Now, if you only have one drive in your system, it's pretty straightforward. It's gonna only one's gonna show up. But I would highly recommend to take that drive 1. We're gonna hit New. We're gonna Apply. And we're gonna hit OK. We're gonna give it a second, and now it's ready to go. Don't worry about your hard drive. We're gonna deal with that once we get into Windows. But make sure to install it on your SSD. If for some reason you're installing like a 1 terabyte hard drive and a 1 terabyte SSD, I guess you could just unplug the hard drive to make sure you know which one's which, because again, there's no real way of telling what drive. You can just see how actually like big the capacity is. But I think almost anyone who has 2 drives are gonna be different sizes and you'll know which one's which. But anyway, make sure to install this on the actual SSD. So I'm gonna hit Next, making sure that it is automatically selected the primary partition. And at this point, sit back, give it a little while. I will tell you that if you haven't built a PC in a while, Windows used to take forever to install, but with like modern like CPUs and especially like SSDs, this might only take like 10 minutes or so. So I'll be right back as soon as it's done with the install. And there we go, we're ready to get going. That took like 5 minutes. Now you'll notice that when you go to the Windows setup, your screen's gonna look a little weird, a little blurry. We don't have drivers installed. It's not gonna be running at the correct resolution. Don't worry about it, we'll deal with that later. So most of this is really straightforward. You're just gonna kind of click through, make sure your keyboard's right, yada, yada, yada. There's only one thing I really want to point out, which is that we're going to need to be connected to a network. Now, if you're using Windows 10, this is a prompt that you can ignore. If you're using Windows 11 Home Edition like we are, you do need an internet connection. So you can plug in via Ethernet, which is what I'm going to do. You also, if you've got a Wi-Fi module built into your motherboard, you can do that. I am going to find my Ethernet cable down here. I'm gonna plug this in. One of the reasons people don't like Windows 11, if I'm honest with you. So I'm gonna plug my Ethernet in, give it a minute, it should automatically pop up, and then it will start to download some initial updates. And at this point, as soon as you actually get online, everything is gonna be really straightforward. Just click through, log in with your Microsoft account, yada, yada, yada. There's nothing that's all that spicy. Or the Ethernet cannot work. So here's the other thing that makes it real fun. Sometimes it don't wanna work. And they don't want to work. If you were unfortunate enough to be in the position I am, in which my computer doesn't want to get online, you can bypass this setup. So I'm gonna hit Shift and F10 on our keyboard. We're gonna type in OOBE backspace bypass NRO enter. So this is gonna put us in limited setup mode. It will work theoretically. It just doesn't like to do this, but in a case like this where it doesn't wanna work with our drivers, what are you gonna do? Does it backspace? Yeah. Backslash! Don't hit backspace, that just deletes whatever you just typed. Yeah. I'm a front slash guy, so I don't think about backslash a lot. All right, we'll try that one more time. Yep, skip. I don't have internet. Haha! Continue with limited setup. Imagine if that was just a button you could press from the beginning. All right, so now we're gonna go through the setup. So again, at this point, it's basically the same regardless of whether you were lucky enough to have the internet grace your presence or not. So log in. For this case, because we don't have internet, we're not gonna log into our Microsoft account. We'll do that in a little bit. Create a name, yada, yada, yada. And I will see you on the other side, my friends. With Windows installed, the first thing I'm gonna do is hit the Windows key and type in Task Manager. So all we're doing here, we'll get rid of this gigabyte thing, is just make sure that everything is showing up correctly. It should, but we see AMD Ryzen 7, 7700X, sweet. We see 31 or 32 gigs of RAM, sweet. We see our hard drive and our SSD, both of those are fine, and that's pretty much it. So we can actually take out our Windows flash drive now. Keep this handy if you ever need to reinstall Windows, but you can easily remake one of these, so it's not super important. And now it is time to grab our drivers. Now, if your computer is online and everything is functioning, you can just download these directly. But because we're not online yet, I'm gonna come over to my laptop here with my flash drive installed, and I'm gonna download a few things. So, in this same support page that we downloaded the BIOS, you're gonna see a bunch of drivers. You wanna download almost all of these. You'll see, for example, for audio, there's two versions. There's an older one and a newer one, so I'm gonna download the newer version. We're gonna grab chipset. So again, we'll grab the newer versions, which are APU and chipset. So we're gonna download both of these. You know, grab your LAN driver, very important. So we're gonna grab the most recent version, which looks like it is from December of 2023, and we're gonna grab it for Windows 11. You can sort in the actual setup here which driver OS you have, but it's pretty simple. We don't actually need the RAID driver, we'll show that later, and the wireless, Bluetooth, all this kind of stuff. So I'm gonna download all of the things. So we got all these set up. Now there is also utility, which is going to be the Gigabyte Control Center. I'm actually gonna do this later. Every motherboard manufacturer is gonna have different sort of setups. So typically they'll have some kind of like master piece of software which will help you pull downloads and updates from that point. And I will say that Windows, once you actually get this online, Windows Update will do its best to grab some drivers, but typically I like to grab the drivers directly from the manufacturer of my motherboard to make sure that they are as up to date and everything as possible. So I've got all of my Gigabyte drivers downloaded, but before I move on, just because I know my system's not online, I don't have to deal with it, I'm also gonna look up NVIDIA drivers. Now you would do this exact same thing if this was AMD or Intel. You just wanna download the drivers for your specific GPU. So for us, we know that we have a GeForce card. I have a 40 series, and it is a 4070 Super. That's super good. Windows 11, and then we hit search, and it should give us the most up-to-date driver. So we're gonna download that as well. And then once we've got everything downloaded, we're gonna copy all of it over to our flash drive and move it over to the system. Downloading your motherboard drivers and your graphics drivers are the most important thing. Now, at this point, you will probably wanna download some other stuff. So for example, because we have a Lian Li case and cooler, we would want to download the Lian Li L-Connect software, which will allow us to not only adjust, of course, all of our RGB and stuff, but specifically adjust the actual screen here. I'm not gonna show you how to do that. I'll be honest with you, every bit of RGB software is different. Download whatever setup is correct for your system. Go through the little tutorial. Be aware that sometimes that RGB stuff can be really finicky, but it's gotten better. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just gonna show you how to get this thing online with the correct graphics drivers, and then we're gonna run Windows Update and we should hopefully be done. All right, so everything is copied over to my driver USB. I'm gonna plug this in. So I'm just gonna plug it into the back USBs. It's a really small note, but typically the fastest USB ports on your computer are the ones on the motherboard. These are fine, but sometimes they're like only USB 3.0 speeds. It doesn't really matter, but if you got like an SSD or something faster, I just always like plugging into the motherboard. It feels a little bit more reliable. All right, so with that plugged in, we're gonna go into File Manager. We see our drivers. We're gonna copy all of this stuff over into our, I just put in Documents or Downloads. So I copy everything over to our actual SSD or our computer itself. Once everything is copied over, we want to run it off the internal drive because it's going to be a lot faster. Ideally, as you install these drivers, things start to work. Thankfully, after some driver downloads and a quick restart, we are now online. So at this point, we're almost done. So I do have this little pop-up asking me to download Gigabyte Control Center. I will do that because that is that sort of overall piece of software that's gonna help me to make sure that everything is up to date. And the last step is going to be to download updates. And believe me when I say, Windows is gonna have a whole lot of updates. So let it run. You may need to restart a couple of times and check it again and it will show up. We're not quite done yet. One really quick little thing. Let me quickly hop into our display. I say this just because it's easy to miss. Double check your resolution and specifically the frame rate on your monitor before we finish. So you'll see here that this is a 1440p monitor, which is correct, but we also want to pull up the advanced display. So this is going to be in your actual system display settings. So if you click on this, it immediately does give us 240 hertz, good. If you have a high refresh rate monitor, sometimes they'll default to 60, and you might not realize that you're not getting the full experience out of your monitor. Now, we have successfully built ourselves a gaming computer! Yay! Congratulations. Thank you very much to Micro Center for sponsoring this tutorial. As always, if you're ever interested in buying any PC components, Micro Center is your #1 stop for all things gaming computer related. So excuse me, my friends, I'm going to go and apologize to our wonderful edit team for asking them to edit through 17 hours of footage. But hopefully you found this tutorial helpful. If you did, make sure to subscribe to the channel, ring that ding-a-ling button, and check out all of the components that we purchased for this video at the links in the description. Whoo! I'll see you next year.